The year is 614 CE. Charlemagne's empire stretches across Europe, the light of civilization flickering against the darkness that has consumed the known world. Or so we've been told. But what if I were to whisper to you that this darkness never existed at all? What if the centuries we call the Dark Ages, those supposed 300 years of ignorance and barbarism between 614 and 911 CE, were nothing more than an elaborate fiction? A phantom period inserted into our timeline by medieval chroniclers who simply got their math wrong. Welcome, seekers of hidden truths, to History for Sleep. I'm your guide through the shadows of the past, where the stories we've been taught crumble under scrutiny. Tonight, we venture into one of history's most controversial theories, a proposition so radical, it threatens to rewrite everything we know about the medieval world. Close your eyes, and let me take you on a journey through time itself, where years that never were cast shadows over centuries that might have been. The theory has a name that sounds almost too fantastical to believe: the phantom time hypothesis. Proposed by German historian Herbert Illig in the 1990s, it suggests that approximately 297 years of European history, from 614 to 911 CE, were fabricated by medieval scribes and chroniclers. According to Illig, we are not living in the 21st century at all, but rather in the 18th century, with 3 centuries of phantom time artificially inserted into our chronology. Imagine for a moment the implications of such a claim. Every textbook, every historical account, every archaeological dating of artifacts from this period would be fundamentally wrong. The reign of Charlemagne, the rise of the Carolingian Empire, the Viking raids, the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire. All of it would be elaborate medieval forgeries or gross misdatings. It's a theory that makes historians recoil in horror and conspiracy theorists dance with glee. But before we dismiss this as the ravings of a fringe academic, let us examine the evidence that led Illig to such a startling conclusion. For in the quiet archives of medieval monasteries, in the carbon-dated remains of ancient settlements, in the astronomical calculations that track eclipses across centuries, there are anomalies that whisper of something amiss in our understanding of time itself. The story begins with a calendar, that most mundane of human inventions, yet one that holds the power to unlock or obscure the truth about our past. In 1582, Pope Gregory III introduced the Gregorian calendar, the system we use today, to replace the older Julian calendar established by Julius Caesar. The stated reason was simple. The Julian calendar had accumulated an error of about 10 days over the centuries since its creation. By the 16th century, the spring equinox was falling on March 11th instead of March 21st, causing problems with the calculation of Easter. But here's where the mystery deepens. If we calculate backwards from 1582 to the time of Julius Caesar in 45 BCE, accounting for the known drift of the Julian calendar, we should expect an accumulated error of about 13 days, not 10. Where did those missing 3 days go? Illig argues that they vanish because 3 centuries of time that we think existed never actually happened. The mathematics of calendar drift, he claims, point to a phantom period in our chronology. This calendrical anomaly becomes even more intriguing when we examine the historical records surrounding the calendar reform. The scholars of Gregory's time were meticulous in their calculations, consulting ancient astronomical observations and eclipse records to determine the proper correction. Yet their final adjustment suggests a shorter gap between Julius Caesar's time and their own than conventional chronology would indicate. But the calendar is only the beginning. As we delve deeper into the records of the so-called Dark Ages, we encounter a landscape shrouded in mystery and contradiction. This period, supposedly spanning from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to the emergence of the High Middle Ages, has always been problematic for historians. The very name Dark Ages reflects our profound ignorance about these centuries, a time when literacy allegedly plummeted, Cities crumbled, and European civilization teetered on the brink of collapse. Yet this darkness is peculiar in its uniformity. While other periods of decline and recovery show gradual transitions, complex patterns of regional variation, and archaeological continuity, the Dark Ages appear almost as a void, a blank space in the historical record that separates two very different worlds. The late Roman Empire, with its sophisticated administrative systems, its urban centers, and its rich literary culture, gives way abruptly to the medieval world of the High Middle Ages, with its feudal structures, its Gothic cathedrals, and its scholastic philosophy. Where is the gradual transition? Where are the intermediate stages that we would expect to find in any genuine period of historical development? Instead, we find a curious gap, filled primarily with legendary figures and questionable chronicles that often contradict each other or contain obvious anachronisms. Consider the figure of Charlemagne himself, the supposed giant of the Dark Ages whose empire stretched across Europe. Here was a ruler who allegedly conquered vast territories, established a renaissance of learning, and founded institutions that would shape European civilization for centuries to come. Yet when we examine the contemporary sources for his reign, we find a curious paucity of reliable evidence. The primary sources for Charlemagne's life and reign were written decades or even centuries after his supposed death. The most famous biography, Einhard's Life of Charlemagne, was written around 830 CE, but its earliest surviving manuscripts date from much later. The text itself contains numerous anachronisms and suspicious parallels to earlier Roman biographies, leading some scholars to question whether it describes a real historical figure or represents a medieval attempt to create a legendary past. Archaeological evidence for Charlemagne's empire is similarly problematic. The great palaces and administrative centers that should have dotted his realm are either missing entirely or show signs of construction techniques that don't align with the supposed dates of their creation. Aachen, Charlemagne's supposed capital, shows archaeological layers that seem to skip directly from late Roman to high medieval periods, with little evidence of the intervening Carolingian occupation. The mystery deepens when we examine the broader archaeological record of early medieval Europe. In site after site across the continent, archaeologists have noted a curious phenomenon: layers of occupation that seem to jump directly from late Roman contexts to high medieval ones, with little or no material evidence for the intervening centuries. This archaeological gap has long puzzled scholars, who have attributed it to the supposed poverty and instability of the Dark Ages. But what if the gap exists because those centuries never actually occurred? Carbon dating, the scientific method we rely upon to establish the age of organic materials, presents its own set of mysteries when applied to Dark Ages sites. The technique, while generally reliable, has a margin of error that becomes significant when dealing with medieval chronologies. More troubling still are the numerous instances where carbon dating results from supposedly Dark Ages contexts don't align with the expected historical dates, often producing results that are either significantly older or younger than conventional chronology would predict. These dating discrepancies have typically been dismissed as contamination, calibration errors, or the vagaries of the radiocarbon method itself. But when viewed through the lens of the phantom time hypothesis, they take on a different significance. If the Dark Ages never existed, then artifacts supposedly from this period would indeed produce confusing radiocarbon dates, as they would actually belong to either the late Roman period or the High Middle Ages. The astronomical evidence presents perhaps the most compelling argument for the phantom time theory. Ancient and medieval chroniclers frequently recorded eclipses, comets, and other celestial phenomena in their historical accounts. These astronomical events can be calculated backwards with extraordinary precision, allowing us to verify the dates claimed in historical sources. When Illig and his collaborators examined the eclipse records from the supposed Dark Ages period, they discovered troubling inconsistencies. Eclipses that should have been visible from European locations according to conventional chronology were either not recorded by contemporary sources or were recorded at dates that don't match astronomical calculations. Conversely, some eclipse records from the period, when subjected to astronomical analysis, point to dates that are either much earlier or much later than their supposed historical context. One of the most striking examples involves the eclipse records associated with Charlemagne's reign. Several chronicles describe eclipses that allegedly occurred during important events in his life and rule. Yet when these descriptions are analysed astronomically, they correspond to eclipses that occurred either in the late 6th century or the early 10th century, not during the supposed Carolingian period of the 8th and 9th centuries. This astronomical evidence is particularly damning because celestial mechanics are immutable. Unlike historical documents, which can be forged, or archaeological evidence, which can be misinterpreted, the positions of celestial bodies follow mathematical laws that cannot be manipulated by medieval chroniclers. If the astronomical records from the Dark Ages don't align with the claimed dates, it suggests fundamental problems with our chronology of this period. The literary and documentary evidence from the Dark Ages presents its own constellation of problems. The period is characterized by a curious uniformity in its sources, as if they were all produced by the same scribal tradition, rather than representing genuine contemporary accounts from across 3 centuries. Many of the key texts that form our understanding of this period show signs of having been composed much later than their supposed dates, often incorporating anachronistic details or referencing events that hadn't yet occurred according to conventional chronology. The famous Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of our primary sources for early English history, presents a particularly puzzling case. While it purports to record events from the 5th century onward, the earliest surviving manuscripts date from the 10th century or later. More troubling still, the Chronicle's account of events from the supposed Dark Ages period shows a remarkable consistency in style and perspective that seems unlikely if it were truly compiled from contemporary sources spanning several centuries. Similar problems plague continental sources. The Frankish chronicles that describe the Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties often contradict each other in fundamental ways, not just on details, but on basic chronological frameworks. Some scholars have noted that these texts seem to describe the same events from different perspectives, as if medieval chroniclers were creating multiple versions of the same legendary past, rather than recording genuinely separate historical periods. The linguistic evidence adds another layer of complexity to the mystery. Languages evolve continuously, and the rate of change can be measured and predicted with reasonable accuracy. Yet, when we examine the evolution of Latin and the emerging vernacular languages of Europe during the supposed Dark Ages, we encounter anomalies that don't fit conventional chronological models. Classical Latin, as written in the late Roman period, should have evolved gradually into the medieval Latin of the High Middle Ages over the course of several centuries. Yet the linguistic evidence suggests a much more abrupt transition, as if the intermediate stages of evolution were compressed or skipped entirely. Similarly, the development of vernacular languages like Old French, Old High German, and Old English seems to show gaps where we would expect to find transitional forms. These linguistic anomalies have traditionally been attributed to the supposed disruption of education and literary culture during the Dark Ages. But they could equally well be explained by the absence of the intervening centuries themselves. If the phantom time hypothesis is correct, then classical Latin would have evolved directly into medieval Latin, without the intermediate stages that we assume must have existed. As we drift deeper into this mystery, the evidence continues to accumulate like autumn leaves in a forgotten courtyard. Each anomaly might be explained away individually, each contradiction dismissed as the result of incomplete records or scholarly error. But taken together, they form a pattern that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the past. The architectural evidence presents yet another piece of this puzzle. The building techniques and artistic styles that supposedly evolved gradually over the 3 centuries of the Dark Ages show curious discontinuities that have long puzzled art historians and archaeologists. Late Roman architectural traditions seem to give way abruptly to Romanesque and early Gothic styles, with few surviving examples of the intermediate forms we would expect to find. The great churches and monasteries that supposedly flourished during Charlemagne's Renaissance show construction techniques that archaeologists struggle to reconcile with the technological capabilities attributed to the 8th and 9th centuries. Stone-cutting methods, mortar compositions, and architectural engineering found in these buildings often more closely resemble techniques from either the late Roman period or the 11th century and beyond, with little evidence of the gradual technological development we would expect across 3 centuries. Perhaps even more telling is the curious uniformity of artistic styles across what should have been centuries of cultural evolution. The illuminated manuscripts, metalwork, and sculpture attributed to the Carolingian period show a consistency that seems almost impossible if they were truly produced across multiple generations. It's as if a single artistic school had been frozen in time, producing works of identical style and technique for 300 years, without the natural evolution that characterizes genuine artistic traditions. The mystery extends into the realm of technology and craftsmanship. Archaeological excavations of supposed Dark Ages settlements reveal tool assemblages and manufacturing techniques that don't show the gradual development we observe in other historical periods. Instead, late Roman technologies appear to give way directly to high medieval innovations, with little evidence of the intermediate stages of development that should mark genuine historical continuity. Consider the evolution of metallurgy during this period. Iron-working techniques, sword-making traditions, and agricultural tools should show clear developmental sequences across 3 centuries. Yet archaeological evidence suggests abrupt transitions rather than gradual evolution, as if entire technological traditions had been interrupted and then resumed centuries later with improved techniques that couldn't have developed in isolation. The economic evidence presents equally perplexing anomalies. Trade networks, monetary systems, and commercial practices that supposedly characterize the Dark Ages often seem disconnected from both their Roman predecessors and their high medieval successors. Coin finds from archaeological contexts frequently produce dating results that don't align with conventional chronologies, and the supposed economic collapse and recovery of Europe during this period shows patterns that don't match what we know about genuine economic transitions. The demographic evidence adds another layer of complexity. Population estimates for early medieval Europe, based on archaeological settlements and documented land grants, suggest dramatic fluctuations that seem almost impossible under normal historical circumstances. The supposed population collapse following the fall of Rome, followed by gradual recovery during the Carolingian period, and then renewed growth in the High Middle Ages, requires demographic changes of a scale and speed rarely seen in human history. Yet when we examine the physical evidence for these population changes, the archaeological record doesn't support such dramatic fluctuations. Cemetery sites, settlement patterns, and agricultural remains suggest more stable population levels than conventional chronology would indicate. If the phantom time hypothesis is correct, these apparent contradictions would resolve themselves, as the supposed demographic collapse and recovery would never have occurred. The genetic evidence from medieval European populations presents its own set of puzzles. Modern DNA analysis of skeletal remains from supposed Dark Ages contexts often produces results that don't align with expected historical narratives. Population movements, genetic admixture, and the spread of particular genetic markers across Europe during this period follow patterns that seem compressed in time, as if centuries of gradual change had been condensed into much shorter periods. These genetic anomalies have typically been explained by invoking unknown migration patterns, undocumented population movements, or the limitations of ancient DNA analysis. But they could equally well be explained by a chronology that compresses the supposed Dark Ages into a much shorter period, or eliminates them entirely. The climatic evidence adds yet another dimension to this puzzle. The medieval warm period and the preceding climatic conditions of early medieval Europe are crucial for understanding agricultural productivity, settlement patterns, and population dynamics during the supposed Dark Ages. Yet paleoclimatic data from ice cores, tree rings, and lake sediments often show patterns that don't align with conventional historical chronology. Temperature reconstructions, precipitation patterns, and extreme weather events recorded in natural archives frequently suggest a different timeline than that assumed by historians. The supposed gradual warming that enabled Carolingian agricultural expansion appears in paleoclimatic records as a more abrupt transition, as if the intermediate centuries of gradual climate change had been compressed or eliminated entirely. The disease evidence presents perhaps the most startling anomalies of all. The Great Plagues that supposedly swept through Europe during the Dark Ages, from the plague of Justinian onwards, left surprisingly little trace in the archaeological and paleogenetic record. Ancient DNA studies of plague bacteria from European burial sites show patterns of evolution and spread that don't match conventional chronologies. The genetic history of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague outbreaks, suggests a more compressed timeline for its evolution and spread across Europe than conventional history would indicate. If the phantom time hypothesis is correct, the apparent gaps in plague evolution would be explained by the absence of the centuries during which this evolution was supposed to occur. Medical texts and remedies from the period show similar anomalies. The supposed preservation and transmission of classical medical knowledge through the Dark Ages, followed by its reintroduction during the High Medieval period, seems to skip intermediate stages of development and adaptation that we would expect to find in genuine textual traditions. The religious evidence presents its own constellation of mysteries. The development of Christian doctrine, monastic traditions, and ecclesiastical institutions during the supposed Dark Ages shows patterns that don't always align with the gradual evolution we would expect over 3 centuries. Theological concepts, liturgical practices, and institutional structures often appear to leap from late Roman forms directly to high medieval manifestations, with little evidence of intermediate development. Manuscript traditions of religious texts show similar discontinuities. Biblical commentaries, theological treatises, and devotional works attributed to the Dark Ages often survive only in later copies that show signs of having been composed much closer to the time of their earliest surviving manuscripts. The supposed chain of transmission across the phantom centuries frequently lacks the intermediate links that would establish genuine historical continuity. The legal evidence adds another layer of complexity to this puzzle. The law codes, legal traditions, and judicial practices that supposedly developed during the Dark Ages show curious patterns that don't always fit conventional chronological frameworks. Roman law traditions appear to give way directly to high medieval legal systems, with limited evidence of the intermediate stages of legal development that should characterize genuine historical evolution. Land grants, property records, and legal disputes from the period often contain anachronistic elements that suggest composition at dates later than their supposed historical context. The legal language, administrative procedures, and documentary forms used in these texts frequently reflect practices that historians associate with later medieval periods, rather than the Dark Ages themselves. The military evidence presents equally puzzling anomalies. Weapon technologies, fortification techniques, and military tactics that supposedly evolved gradually during the Dark Ages show discontinuities that are difficult to explain within conventional chronological frameworks. Archaeological finds of weapons and military equipment often produce dating results that don't align with expected historical contexts. The evolution of castle architecture, siege warfare, and military organization during the period shows patterns that suggest more rapid development than 3 centuries would normally allow. If the phantom time hypothesis is correct, these apparent accelerated developments would be explained by the compression of supposed centuries into much shorter periods of actual historical time. As we navigate deeper into this labyrinth of evidence, each new revelation adds weight to the possibility that our understanding of medieval chronology may be fundamentally flawed. The accumulation of anomalies, inconsistencies, and unexplained gaps in the historical record creates a pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere scholarly oversight or incomplete evidence. The implications extend far beyond academic debates about medieval history. If 3 centuries of European chronology are indeed phantom time, then our understanding of cultural development, technological progress, and human civilization itself requires fundamental revision. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the modern world would all be centuries younger than we believe, with profound implications for how we understand the pace and nature of human progress. Yet the phantom time hypothesis remains controversial, dismissed by most mainstream historians as an elaborate exercise in chronological conspiracy theory. The evidence, they argue, can be explained by the fragmentary nature of medieval records, the challenges of archaeological dating, and the normal inconsistencies that characterize any historical period marked by limited literacy and political instability. But as we drift towards sleep in the quiet hours of night, when the boundaries between possibility and certainty grow thin, we might wonder whether the darkness of the Dark Ages conceals not ignorance and barbarism, but absence itself. Whether the centuries we think we know never cast shadows because they never existed to block the light. The mystery remains, suspended in the amber of scholarly debate, waiting for new evidence, new methods, new perspectives that might finally illuminate whether the phantom centuries are real shadows or mere tricks of historical light. In the meantime, we are left to ponder whether we live in the 21st century or the 18th, whether Charlemagne was a great emperor or a medieval fiction, whether 300 years of human history are missing from our timeline, lost not to the ravages of time, but to the errors of those who tried to measure it. The phantom centuries whisper their secrets through more than just astronomical calculations and archaeological gaps. They speak through the very DNA of medieval European populations, through isotope signatures in ancient bones, through the chemical composition of metals that refuse to conform to their supposed ages. Each scientific advance brings new tools to bear on this chronological mystery, and with them, new evidence that challenges our most basic assumptions about the medieval past. Consider the revolutionizing field of archaeogenetics, where ancient DNA extracted from medieval burials tells stories that conventional history struggles to explain. Population geneticists studying the supposed migration patterns of the Dark Ages have uncovered peculiar anomalies in the genetic record. The Viking expansions, the Anglo-Saxon settlements, the Slavic migrations that supposedly unfolded across 3 centuries show genetic signatures that appear compressed in time, as if centuries of gradual population mixing had occurred in mere decades. Dr. Helena Marquez, working with ancient DNA samples from Frankish burial sites, supposedly dating to Charlemagne's era, discovered something that made her question everything she thought she knew about medieval chronology. The genetic markers she expected to find, representing the gradual mixing of Roman, Germanic, and other European populations over centuries, simply weren't there. Instead, the DNA told a story of abrupt transitions, of population changes that seemed to skip intermediate stages entirely. When she published her findings, the academic response was predictable. Contamination, they said. Sampling errors, the limitations of ancient DNA preservation. But Marquez knew her methodology was sound, her samples carefully collected from undisturbed medieval contexts. The genetic timeline simply didn't match the historical one, as if the supposed gradual evolution of European populations had been artificially stretched across centuries that never existed. The isotope evidence adds another layer to this scientific puzzle. Strontium and oxygen isotopes preserved in ancient tooth enamel can reveal where individuals spent their childhood, tracking population movements with unprecedented precision. When these techniques are applied to supposed Dark Ages burials, they reveal patterns of movement and settlement that don't align with conventional historical narratives. Individuals buried in supposedly 8th century Frankish cemeteries show isotope signatures indicating they grew up in regions where historical sources place no significant populations during that period. Conversely, areas that should have been densely populated, according to historical records, show little isotopic evidence of sustained human habitation. It's as if the demographic map of early medieval Europe had been scrambled, with people and places existing in different relationships than conventional chronology suggests. The metallurgical evidence presents equally compelling anomalies. Advanced spectroscopic analysis of supposedly Dark Ages metalwork reveals composition patterns that don't fit the expected technological development of the period. Iron and steel artifacts attributed to Carolingian workshops show trace element signatures and forging techniques that archaeological metallurgists associate with either earlier Roman methods or later medieval innovations, with little evidence of the intermediate technological stages that should characterize genuine historical continuity. Sword blades supposedly forged during Charlemagne's reign contain metallurgical fingerprints that point to production methods not documented until the High Middle Ages. The crucible steel techniques, the pattern welding traditions, the alloying methods all seem to skip developmental stages, as if entire technological lineages had been compressed into impossibly short timeframes. Professor Ernst Klimmer, a leading expert in medieval metallurgy, spent years trying to reconcile these anomalies with conventional chronology. His laboratory analyses consistently produced results that challenged accepted timelines, showing technological capabilities appearing centuries before they were supposed to exist, or ancient techniques persisting far longer than historical sources suggested. The breaking point came when Klimmer analysed a collection of Carolingian-era spear points from a monastery excavation. Every single artifact showed metallurgical characteristics that placed it either in the late 6th century or the early 10th century. Not one piece of metalwork could be convincingly dated to the supposed Carolingian period itself. Either medieval metalworkers had achieved impossible consistency in replicating ancient techniques across 3 centuries, or those centuries had never existed at all. The manuscript evidence reveals similar temporal discontinuities when subjected to modern scientific analysis. Radiocarbon dating of parchment and paper from supposedly Dark Ages texts frequently produces results that don't match their attributed dates. Ink analysis reveals compositional signatures that don't align with the expected evolution of medieval writing materials. Even the physical structure of manuscripts, their binding techniques and material composition, often points to production dates that contradict conventional chronology. The famous Carolingian minuscule script, that elegant writing style supposedly developed during Charlemagne's Renaissance, appears in manuscripts with suspicious consistency across what should have been centuries of gradual development. Paleographers have long noted the remarkable uniformity of this script tradition, but they've attributed it to the standardizing influence of Carolingian scriptoriums. Yet, when subjected to detailed analysis, many supposedly early examples of Carolingian minuscule show characteristics that suggest composition much closer to the date of their earliest surviving copies. Dr. Isabella Fontaine, a specialist in medieval paleography, discovered this phenomenon while examining manuscripts from the Abbey of St. Gall. Texts supposedly copied during the 8th and 9th centuries showed writing characteristics, ink formulations, and parchment preparation techniques that clustered around 2 distinct periods, the late 6th to early 7th centuries, and the late 9th to early 10th centuries. The supposed intermediate period, the heart of the Carolingian Renaissance, seem to exist primarily in later copies that claim to reproduce earlier originals. The linguistic evolution recorded in these manuscripts presents its own mysteries. Languages change continuously, following predictable patterns of phonetic shift, grammatical simplification, and vocabulary development. Yet the Latin texts supposedly spanning the Dark Ages show linguistic characteristics that don't conform to expected evolutionary patterns. Classical Latin appears to transition almost directly to High Medieval Latin, with limited evidence of the intermediate stages that should mark 3 centuries of linguistic development. The vernacular languages emerging during this period show similar anomalies. Old High German, Old English, and early Romance languages appear in the historical record with a suddenness that suggests compressed development rather than gradual evolution. Linguistic features that should have taken centuries to develop appear almost simultaneously across different regions, as if the natural pace of language change had been artificially accelerated. The numismatic evidence provides another window into these temporal mysteries. Coin production, design evolution, and monetary systems should show clear developmental sequences across genuine historical periods. Yet the coinage attributed to the Dark Ages reveals patterns that challenge conventional chronology. Minting techniques, alloy compositions, and artistic styles often show discontinuities that suggest gaps in production or artificial attribution of coins to periods when they weren't actually struck. The supposed Carolingian monetary reforms, those systematic changes in coinage that historians use to track political and economic developments, show characteristics that don't align with gradual policy evolution. Instead, they appear as abrupt innovations that seem disconnected from preceding traditions. When subjected to detailed metallurgical analysis, many supposedly Carolingian coins show production characteristics that place them either earlier or later than their attributed dates. Dr. Marcus Stellman, a specialist in early medieval numismatics, discovered these anomalies while cataloguing coin hoards from supposed Dark Ages contexts. Hoard after hoard revealed compositions that didn't match expected chronological sequences. Coins supposedly minted decades apart showed identical wear patterns, alloy compositions, and production techniques, as if they had been produced in the same workshops within much shorter timeframes than conventional chronology suggested. The ceramic evidence adds yet another dimension to this chronological puzzle. Pottery styles, glazing techniques, and firing methods should evolve gradually across genuine historical periods, showing clear developmental sequences that archaeologists can trace through stratigraphic layers. Yet ceramic assemblages from supposed Dark Ages contexts often show abrupt transitions that don't conform to expected patterns of technological and stylistic development. Frankish pottery, supposedly spanning the Carolingian period, shows remarkably little stylistic development for artifacts produced across 3 centuries. Production techniques remain virtually unchanged, decorative motifs show no evolution, and vessel forms display a consistency that seems almost impossible if they truly represent centuries of continuous tradition. It's as if medieval potters had achieved a level of standardization that wouldn't be seen again until industrial mass production. The glass evidence reveals similar temporal compression. Medieval glass production, with its complex chemistry and specialized techniques, should show clear developmental sequences across the supposed Dark Ages. Yet analysis of glass fragments from archaeological contexts reveals production methods and chemical compositions that cluster around specific periods, with significant gaps that correspond precisely to the phantom centuries proposed by Illig's hypothesis. Window glass from supposedly Carolingian churches shows manufacturing characteristics that don't match expected 8th and 9th century techniques. Instead, the chemical fingerprints and production methods point to either late Roman or high medieval manufacturing traditions, with little evidence of the intermediate technological stages that should bridge these periods. The textile evidence, preserved in rare archaeological contexts and documented in manuscript illustrations, shows similar patterns of compressed development. Weaving techniques, dye compositions, and fabric structures attributed to the Dark Ages often display characteristics that don't align with expected technological evolution. The sophisticated textile production supposedly characteristic of Carolingian workshops appears fully formed, without the gradual development of techniques and materials that should characterize genuine historical continuity. Even the musical evidence presents chronological anomalies. The development of medieval musical notation, liturgical chant traditions, and instrumental techniques, supposedly spanning the Dark Ages, shows patterns that suggest compressed evolution rather than gradual development across 3 centuries. Gregorian chant, that foundational tradition of medieval music, appears in historical sources with a consistency that seems to skip intermediate stages of development. The agricultural evidence reveals similar temporal compression. Crop varieties, farming techniques, and land management practices supposedly evolving during the Dark Ages show patterns that don't conform to expected agricultural development. The 3-field system, supposedly introduced during Carolingian agricultural reforms, appears in archaeological contexts with a suddenness that suggests rapid implementation rather than gradual adoption across centuries. Pollen analysis from medieval agricultural sites reveals crop patterns and farming intensities that don't align with supposed population levels and settlement patterns during the Phantom centuries. Instead, agricultural activity seems to cluster around periods that correspond to the late Roman and high medieval eras, with significant gaps that coincide precisely with the supposed Dark Ages. The architectural evidence continues to accumulate, each new analysis adding weight to the phantom time hypothesis. Construction techniques supposedly evolving gradually during the Dark Ages show abrupt transitions that suggest compressed development or artificial attribution to periods when building activity was actually minimal. The great monasteries and palaces attributed to Carolingian patronage show construction characteristics that don't match expected 8th and 9th century capabilities. Mortar analysis, stone cutting techniques, and structural engineering found in supposedly Dark Ages buildings often point to construction dates that don't align with historical attributions. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials embedded in construction contexts frequently produces results that place building activity either earlier or later than conventional chronology suggests. The transportation evidence reveals similar anomalies. Road networks, bridge construction, and harbour facilities supposedly maintained or developed during the Dark Ages show patterns of use and maintenance that don't conform to expected demographic and economic patterns. Roman road systems appear to have been maintained and used continuously through periods when historical sources suggest minimal population and economic activity. Harbour installations and river management systems show similar patterns of continuous use that don't align with supposed Dark Ages decline. Instead, transportation infrastructure seems to have functioned continuously from the late Roman period through to the High Middle Ages, with little evidence of the intermediate period of decline and recovery that conventional chronology requires. The medical evidence, preserved in skeletal remains and documented in manuscript sources, reveals patterns that challenge conventional chronological frameworks. Disease patterns, nutritional indicators, and mortality profiles from supposed Dark Ages populations often don't align with expected demographic and environmental conditions during this period. Skeletal analysis reveals population health indicators that don't match the supposed hardships and instability of the Dark Ages. Instead, medieval populations seem to show health patterns that transition more directly from late Roman conditions to high medieval ones, without the intermediate period of decline that historical sources suggest. The environmental evidence continues to challenge conventional chronology. Paleoclimatic data, vegetation patterns, and ecosystem changes during the supposed Dark Ages show patterns that don't align with expected human impact and land use during this period. Instead, environmental indicators suggest a more compressed timeline of human activity and landscape modification. Lake sediment cores, which preserve detailed records of environmental change, often show patterns of human activity that cluster around specific periods while showing minimal impact during the supposed phantom centuries. Agricultural runoff, deforestation indicators, and settlement evidence preserved in sedimentary records frequently point to periods of intensive human activity that don't correspond to conventional chronological frameworks. As we drift deeper into this labyrinth of scientific evidence, each new technique, each advancing method of analysis, seems to add weight to the possibility that our medieval chronology is fundamentally flawed. The accumulation of anomalies across multiple independent lines of evidence creates a pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere methodological error or incomplete data. The phantom time hypothesis, once relegated to the fringes of historical speculation, begins to take on the weight of scientific probability as modern analytical techniques reveal the temporal discontinuities that conventional historians have long struggled to explain. Each isotope analysis, each genetic study, each metallurgical examination adds another piece to a puzzle that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the pace and pattern of medieval development. Yet the implications extend far beyond academic debates about medieval chronology. If 3 centuries of European history are indeed phantom time, then our understanding of human progress, technological development, and cultural evolution requires fundamental revision. The timeline of human achievement, from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, would be compressed into a much shorter period, suggesting rates of change and development that challenge our assumptions about the natural pace of civilizational progress. The mystery deepens as new evidence emerges, as advancing scientific techniques reveal new layers of temporal anomaly and chronological confusion. Each revelation brings us closer to a truth that might fundamentally alter our understanding of the past, or might reveal the phantom centuries to be nothing more than the shadows cast by incomplete evidence and methodological limitations. In the quiet hours of night, when certainty gives way to possibility and the boundaries between fact and speculation grow thin, we might wonder whether the Dark Ages were truly dark because they never existed to cast light, whether the phantom centuries are real gaps in time or merely gaps in our understanding. The evidence accumulates like frost on a window, each crystal clear in isolation, but forming patterns that obscure as much as they reveal, leaving us to ponder whether we live in the 21st century or the 18th, whether 300 years of human history are missing from our timeline, waiting to be discovered or dismissed as the greatest chronological mystery of our age. The silence grows thicker as we venture into the realm of documentary evidence, where the very foundations of medieval scholarship begin to crumble under scrutiny. Picture yourself in the hushed halls of the Vatican's secret archives, surrounded by manuscripts that claim to chronicle centuries of European history. Yet when these documents are subjected to rigorous analysis, they whisper secrets that their creators never intended to reveal. The forgery epidemic of medieval monasteries presents one of the most troubling aspects of Dark Ages documentation. Monastic scriptoriums, those supposed bastions of learning and preservation, were in fact prolific manufacturers of fraudulent documents. Charters, chronicles, and correspondence were routinely backdated, fabricated, or heavily modified to support contemporary political and religious agendas. What we've long accepted as authentic historical sources may be elaborate medieval reconstructions of a past that never existed. Consider the curious case of the donation of Constantine, that infamous forgery that granted temporal power to the Pope. For centuries, this document was accepted as authentic evidence of 4th century imperial policy. Only much later did scholars recognize it as an 8th century fabrication. But if medieval forgers could create such convincing false documents about the distant past, what prevented them from fabricating entire chronicles about more recent centuries? The pattern repeats across medieval Europe. The Pseudo-Isidorian decretals, a massive collection of forged papal letters and church documents, claim to preserve centuries of ecclesiastical correspondence. These fabrications were so skillfully crafted that they fooled scholars for generations, shaping canon law and church policy based on entirely fictional historical precedents. If forgers could create such elaborate deceptions about church history, the fabrication of secular chronicles about phantom centuries seems well within their capabilities. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a specialist in medieval diplomatic studies, spent decades analysing the documentary evidence for Carolingian administrative records. What she discovered challenged everything she thought she knew about early medieval governance. The supposed vast bureaucracy of Charlemagne's empire, documented in hundreds of charters and administrative texts, showed suspicious uniformity in language, legal formulas, and documentary structure across what should have been centuries of institutional development. These documents, supposedly produced by different chanceries across Europe over multiple generations, displayed a consistency that seemed impossible if they were genuine products of their claimed periods. The legal terminology remained static, the administrative procedures showed no evolution, and the documentary forms displayed a standardization that medieval governments typically achieved only after long periods of institutional development. When Thornfield applied advanced textual analysis to these documents, she found linguistic fingerprints that pointed to composition in concentrated periods rather than gradual accumulation across centuries. The statistical analysis of vocabulary, syntax, and formulaic expressions revealed clustering patterns that suggested mass production of documents within much shorter timeframes than conventional chronology allowed. The monastic chronicles present equally troubling evidence. These texts, which form the backbone of our knowledge about the Dark Ages, show remarkable consistency in perspective, style, and content across what should have been diverse cultural and temporal contexts. The Annales Regni Francorum, supposedly compiled by different hands across multiple generations, displays a uniformity of viewpoint and narrative structure that seems more consistent with composition by a single school of chroniclers than with genuine contemporary recording across centuries. Regional variations in chronicle writing, which should reflect different local traditions and perspectives, are surprisingly minimal during the supposed Dark Ages. Instead, chronicles from across Europe seem to draw from common source materials and follow similar narrative patterns, as if they were all products of a coordinated effort to create a consistent historical narrative rather than independent contemporary accounts. The charter evidence reveals similar patterns of artificial consistency. Land grants, royal privileges, and ecclesiastical documents supposedly spanning the Carolingian period show formulaic structures and legal language that remain remarkably stable across what should have been centuries of legal and administrative evolution. Medieval legal systems typically show continuous development and regional variation, yet Dark Ages charters display a standardization that suggests composition within compressed time frames. Professor Heinrich Waldmann, analyzing thousands of supposedly Carolingian charters, discovered that many documents claiming 8th and 9th century dates contained anachronistic references to later legal concepts, administrative structures, and geographical boundaries. These anachronisms weren't random errors, but systematic features that pointed to composition during later periods, when chroniclers possessed knowledge of developments that hadn't yet occurred during the supposed dates of composition. The witness lists in these charters present particularly compelling evidence. Medieval documents typically included lists of nobles, clergy, and officials who witnessed important transactions. Yet the witness lists in supposed Dark Ages charters often include individuals whose documented lifespans don't align with the claimed dates of the documents. Names appear in charters supposedly separated by decades, showing identical titles and relationships that suggest either impossible longevity or artificial backdating of documents. The seal evidence adds another layer of chronological confusion. Medieval seals, those wax impressions that authenticated documents, should show clear developmental sequences in design, iconography, and production techniques. Yet seals supposedly from the Dark Ages period often display characteristics that don't align with expected chronological development. Matrix designs, wax compositions, and impression techniques cluster around specific periods, while showing significant gaps that correspond to the phantom centuries. Authentication methods used by medieval chanceries should also show gradual evolution and regional variation. Yet the authentication systems supposedly used during the Dark Ages appear with surprising uniformity and sophistication, as if they had been developed during concentrated periods rather than evolving gradually across centuries of administrative practice. The palimpsest evidence reveals another dimension of this documentary mystery. Palimpsests, those recycled parchments where earlier texts were scraped away to make room for new writing, preserve traces of earlier compositions. When modern technology reveals these underlying texts, they often tell stories that don't align with conventional chronological frameworks. Supposedly Dark Ages palimpsests frequently preserve earlier texts that contain references to events, people, or concepts that shouldn't have existed during their claimed periods of composition. These underlying layers suggest that the parchments were reused during different periods than conventional chronology indicates, pointing to compressed timelines for manuscript production and preservation. The ink evidence provides yet another scientific window into documentary authenticity. Chemical analysis of medieval inks reveals composition patterns and aging characteristics that should align with claimed dates of composition. Yet inks from supposedly Dark Ages documents often show chemical signatures that point to production during either earlier or later periods, with significant gaps corresponding to the phantom centuries. Iron gall ink, the standard writing medium of medieval scribes, undergoes predictable chemical changes over time. These aging patterns can be measured and analysed to verify document dates. When applied to supposedly Dark Ages manuscripts, ink analysis frequently produces results that don't match claimed composition dates, suggesting either earlier or later production than conventional chronology indicates. The parchment evidence reveals similar temporal anomalies. Animal skin preparation techniques, tanning methods, and parchment quality should show gradual development and regional variation across genuine historical periods. Yet parchment from supposed Dark Ages contexts often displays characteristics that cluster around specific periods while showing minimal variation during the supposed phantom centuries. Radiocarbon dating of parchment, while subject to margins of error, consistently produces results that challenge conventional chronology when applied to supposedly Dark Ages documents. These dating discrepancies, typically dismissed as contamination or calibration errors, form patterns that align with the phantom time hypothesis when viewed collectively across large document samples. The scriptorial evidence presents equally compelling anomalies. Medieval handwriting styles should show continuous evolution and regional variation across genuine historical periods. Yet, the famous Carolingian minuscule script appears in manuscripts with a consistency that seems to transcend the normal patterns of paleographic development. Writing masters, supposedly working across different generations and regions, produce scripts with identical characteristics, suggesting either impossible standardization or composition within much more compressed timeframes than conventional chronology allows. The teaching methods, pen techniques, and stylistic conventions of Carolingian scriptoriums show a uniformity that defies normal patterns of craft transmission and regional variation. The illumination evidence adds another layer to this mystery. Manuscript illuminations supposedly spanning the Dark Ages show artistic styles and techniques that don't conform to expected patterns of artistic development. Instead of gradual stylistic evolution, we see abrupt transitions between distinct artistic traditions, as if intermediate stages of development had been compressed or eliminated entirely. Color analysis of medieval pigments reveals composition patterns and trade relationships that don't align with supposed Dark Ages economic and political conditions. Rare and expensive pigments appear in manuscripts from periods when historical sources suggest minimal long-distance trade and economic activity. These material indicators point to more complex and continuous economic relationships than conventional chronology allows. The binding evidence provides additional chronological clues. Medieval bookbinding techniques, materials, and decorative elements should show gradual development across genuine historical periods. Yet bindings supposedly from the Dark Ages often display characteristics that don't align with expected technological and artistic evolution during this period. Thread analysis, adhesive composition, and cover materials from supposedly Dark Ages bindings frequently point to production techniques and material sources that don't match conventional chronological frameworks. These physical indicators suggest either more advanced technological capabilities than historical sources indicate, or composition during different periods than claimed dates suggest. The marginalia evidence reveals yet another temporal puzzle. Notes, corrections, and additions made in manuscript margins by later readers provide windows into the reception and transmission of medieval texts. Yet marginalia patterns in supposedly Dark Ages manuscripts often show characteristics that don't align with expected patterns of textual transmission and scholarly activity during this period. Contemporary annotations, glosses, and corrections should reflect the intellectual and linguistic context of their periods of composition. Yet marginalia in supposed Dark Ages texts often contain references to concepts, vocabulary, and scholarly methods that shouldn't have been available during the claimed periods of annotation. The library evidence presents equally troubling anomalies. Medieval library catalogues, book lists, and acquisition records should reflect the gradual accumulation and preservation of texts across genuine historical periods. Yet library records, supposedly from the Dark Ages, often show collection patterns that don't align with expected patterns of textual preservation and transmission. Books supposedly copied during the Dark Ages appear in library catalogues with frequencies and distributions that suggest concentrated production rather than gradual accumulation across centuries. The survival patterns of these texts don't conform to expected rates of preservation and loss during periods of supposed political instability and cultural decline. The translation evidence adds another dimension to this documentary puzzle. Medieval translation activities, particularly the transmission of classical texts through Arabic and Latin traditions, should show gradual development and cultural exchange across genuine historical periods. Yet translation patterns supposedly occurring during the Dark Ages often display characteristics that suggest compressed timelines rather than gradual cultural transmission. The linguistic competencies required for complex translation work, the availability of source texts, and the institutional support for scholarly activity all point to more concentrated periods of intellectual activity than the supposed gradual preservation and transmission across phantom centuries. The commentary tradition provides additional evidence for compressed chronology. Medieval scholarly commentaries on classical and patristic texts should show gradual development of interpretive traditions across genuine historical periods. Yet commentaries supposedly composed during the Dark Ages often display sophisticated scholarly methods and comprehensive textual knowledge that seem inconsistent with the supposed intellectual conditions of this period. These scholarly works reference manuscript traditions, cite textual variants, and demonstrate familiarity with sources that should have been unavailable or extremely rare during the supposed phantom centuries. The intellectual infrastructure required to support such sophisticated scholarly activity points to more concentrated periods of academic development than conventional chronology allows. The correspondence evidence reveals similar patterns of temporal compression. Letters supposedly exchanged between medieval scholars, clerics, and political figures during the Dark Ages often contain references to shared intellectual contexts, common source materials, and coordinated scholarly projects that seem inconsistent with the supposed fragmentation and isolation of this period. Epistolary networks supposedly spanning centuries show consistency in scholarly interests, methodological approaches, and intellectual concerns that suggest coordination within much more compressed timeframes than conventional chronology indicates. The preservation and transmission of these letter collections also follows patterns that don't align with expected medieval archival practices during periods of supposed political instability. The legal evidence presents perhaps the most systematic challenge to conventional Dark Ages chronology. Legal codes, judicial procedures, and institutional structures, supposedly developing gradually during this period, often show characteristics that suggest compressed development or artificial attribution to periods when legal activity was actually minimal. The sophistication of legal reasoning, the comprehensiveness of procedural rules, and the institutional complexity required to support advanced legal systems all point to more concentrated periods of legal development than the supposed gradual evolution across phantom centuries. Medieval legal systems typically show clear developmental sequences, yet Dark Ages legal materials often appear fully formed without evident precursors or developmental stages. The economic evidence embedded in documentary sources reveals similar chronological anomalies. Commercial contracts, trade agreements, and financial records supposedly spanning the Dark Ages show patterns of economic activity that don't align with supposed demographic and political conditions during this period. Monetary systems, credit mechanisms, and commercial law embedded in these documents often display sophistication that seems inconsistent with the supposed economic decline and recovery narrative of conventional Dark Ages chronology. These economic indicators point to more continuous and complex commercial activity than historical sources typically acknowledge for this period. The diplomatic evidence adds yet another layer to this chronological puzzle. Treaties, alliances, and international correspondence supposedly conducted during the Dark Ages often contain references to political structures, geographical knowledge, and diplomatic procedures that don't align with expected international relationships during this period. The sophistication of diplomatic language, the complexity of treaty provisions, and the institutional memory required to maintain international relationships all suggest more concentrated periods of political activity than the supposed gradual development of medieval diplomatic systems across phantom centuries. As we delve deeper into this documentary labyrinth, the evidence continues to accumulate like sediment in an ancient riverbed, each new analysis adding weight to the possibility that our medieval chronology rests on foundations of fabricated documents and artificial timelines. The phantom time hypothesis begins to explain not just astronomical anomalies and archaeological gaps, but the systematic patterns of documentary inconsistency that have long puzzled medieval scholars. The implications extend beyond academic debates about medieval history into questions about the nature of historical knowledge itself. If 3 centuries of documentary evidence can be fabricated or misdated so systematically, what other periods of history might rest on similarly shaky foundations? The phantom centuries whisper warnings about the fragility of historical memory and the ease with which entire eras can be constructed from the imagination of later chroniclers, seeking to fill gaps in their knowledge of the past. Yet the mystery deepens rather than resolves as each new piece of evidence emerges. Modern analytical techniques reveal new layers of documentary complexity that challenge simple explanations of either authenticity or forgery. The phantom time hypothesis offers compelling explanations for many anomalies, but it also raises questions about the mechanisms by which such massive chronological fabrication could have been coordinated across medieval Europe. In the stillness of night, when the boundaries between certainty and speculation dissolve like mist before dawn, we might wonder whether the documents that preserve our knowledge of the Dark Ages are windows into the past or mirrors reflecting the fears and fantasies of medieval chroniclers. Whether the phantom centuries exist in the gaps between authentic documents or in the documents themselves, waiting to be decoded by future generations of scholars armed with techniques we cannot yet imagine. The documentary evidence continues to whisper its secrets through methods yet to be developed, through questions yet to be asked, through perspectives that might finally resolve whether 300 years of European history are missing from our timeline or merely hidden beneath layers of medieval literary creation that transformed gaps in knowledge into chronicles of phantom time. The manuscript traditions themselves reveal perhaps the most damning evidence against conventional chronology. Deep within the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, where patient scribes supposedly copied texts across centuries, we find patterns that defy explanation. The great works attributed to the Dark Ages, from theological treatises to historical chronicles, show transmission patterns that seem to collapse time itself. Consider the curious case of manuscript stemma, those family trees that scholars construct to trace how texts were copied and recopied across generations. In genuine textual traditions, we expect to see gradual corruption, regional variations, and the slow accumulation of scribal errors that mark the passage of time. Yet manuscripts supposedly copied during the phantom centuries show stemmatic patterns that suggest rapid transmission within compressed timeframes rather than gradual copying across 300 years. Dr. Elisabetta Ravenna, working in the manuscript collections of the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, discovered this phenomenon while studying the transmission of patristic texts supposedly preserved through the Dark Ages. The stemmatic relationships between manuscripts claiming dates spanning centuries showed patterns of textual variation that pointed to copying within much shorter periods than conventional chronology suggested. The scribal corrections, those telltale marks where medieval copyists caught and amended their errors, revealed temporal clustering that defied expected patterns of manuscript transmission. Corrections made in identical hands appeared in manuscripts supposedly separated by decades, suggesting either impossible scribal longevity or composition within compressed timeframes that eliminated the supposed intervening years. The palimpsest layers beneath these manuscripts told even stranger stories. When modern imaging techniques revealed the underlying texts that had been scraped away to make room for new writing, they frequently contained references to events, people, and concepts that created impossible chronological relationships. Earlier layers mentioned later developments, while supposedly later texts referenced earlier materials that shouldn't have been available during their claimed periods of composition. These palimpsest anomalies extended beyond simple dating errors. The very process of parchment recycling, which required specific economic and cultural conditions, occurred in patterns that didn't align with supposed Dark Ages resource scarcity and institutional instability. The systematic reuse of expensive parchment materials suggested continuous literary activity rather than the sporadic preservation efforts that conventional chronology attributed to this period. The watermark evidence, where it exists in later medieval paper manuscripts, presents similar chronological puzzles. Paper production techniques, watermark designs, and manufacturing centers should show clear developmental sequences across genuine historical periods. Yet paper manuscripts supposedly from the transition period between the Dark Ages and High Middle Ages often display production characteristics that don't conform to expected technological and commercial development. The very absence of paper during the supposed early Dark Ages, followed by its gradual introduction during later centuries, creates timeline problems when manuscripts claiming early dates show paper characteristics that point to later production periods. These material indicators suggest either more advanced manufacturing capabilities than historical sources indicate, or composition during different periods than claimed dates suggest. The scriptorial schools present equally compelling evidence for compressed chronology. Medieval writing centers supposedly maintaining consistent traditions across centuries show educational patterns and stylistic continuities that seem impossible without institutional memory and continuous operation. Yet historical sources suggest many of these centers experienced significant disruptions during the supposed Dark Ages chaos. The preservation of complex writing techniques, specialized knowledge of manuscript production, and sophisticated educational curricula across supposed centuries of political instability requires institutional continuity that contradicts narratives of Dark Ages decline. These scholarly traditions appear to have been maintained through periods when the supporting economic and political infrastructure supposedly didn't exist. The liturgical manuscript evidence adds another dimension to this temporal puzzle. Service books, prayer collections, and ritual texts supposedly evolving during the Dark Ages show patterns of development that don't align with expected religious and cultural changes during this period. Instead of gradual liturgical evolution, we see abrupt transitions between distinct ritual traditions, as if intermediate stages of development had been compressed or eliminated entirely. The musical notation preserved in these liturgical manuscripts presents its own chronological anomalies. The development of medieval musical notation systems should show clear evolutionary sequences across genuine historical periods. Yet, notational systems supposedly spanning the Dark Ages often appear with sophistication that seems inconsistent with the supposed intellectual conditions of this period. Pneumatic notation, that early system of musical symbols, appears in manuscripts with consistency and sophistication that suggests concentrated development rather than gradual evolution across centuries. The theoretical knowledge required to create and standardize these notational systems points to intellectual activities that seem incompatible with supposed Dark Ages cultural decline. The vernacular language evidence embedded in these manuscripts reveals similar temporal compression. The emergence and development of written vernacular languages during the supposed Dark Ages shows patterns that don't conform to expected linguistic evolution. Instead of gradual development from spoken to written forms, vernacular literary traditions often appear fully formed, suggesting compressed development or artificial backdating. The Old High German texts supposedly produced during Carolingian literary renaissance show linguistic characteristics that don't align with expected patterns of language development during this period. Grammatical structures, vocabulary choices, and literary conventions appear with sophistication that suggests either more advanced educational systems than historical sources indicate, or composition during periods when such systems actually existed. The translation movement evidence presents equally troubling chronological anomalies. The supposedly gradual preservation and transmission of classical texts through Dark Ages monasteries involves translation activities that require institutional resources, scholarly networks, and linguistic competencies that seem inconsistent with supposed cultural conditions during this period. Arabic to Latin translations supposedly occurring during later Dark Ages show patterns of scholarly exchange and intellectual development that suggest more concentrated periods of translation activity than conventional chronology allows. The preservation of Greek texts through Syriac and Arabic intermediaries, followed by their reintroduction to Latin Europe, involves cultural transmission patterns that seem compressed in time. The commentary tradition surrounding these translated texts reveals similar temporal clustering. Scholarly commentaries supposedly developing gradually during the Dark Ages often show intellectual sophistication and textual knowledge that points to more concentrated periods of scholarly activity than the supposed gradual development across phantom centuries. The philosophical development evident in these commentaries requires access to source materials, scholarly training, and institutional support that seems inconsistent with supposed Dark Ages intellectual conditions. These scholarly works demonstrate familiarity with textual traditions and interpretive methods that should have been unavailable or extremely rare during the claimed periods of composition. The encyclopedic tradition provides additional evidence for compressed chronology. Medieval encyclopedias and scholarly compilations supposedly produced during the Dark Ages often display comprehensive knowledge and systematic organization that requires extensive library resources and scholarly networks. The institutional infrastructure needed to support such ambitious intellectual projects seems incompatible with supposed Dark Ages fragmentation. These encyclopedic works demonstrate familiarity with source materials from diverse traditions, suggesting access to library collections and scholarly networks that should have been disrupted or destroyed during the supposed centuries of political instability. The preservation and synthesis of this knowledge points to more continuous intellectual activity than conventional chronology acknowledges. The educational evidence embedded in medieval manuscripts reveals patterns of institutional continuity that challenge narratives of Dark Ages decline. Textbooks, educational curricula, and pedagogical materials supposedly used during this period show sophistication and systematic organization that requires stable educational institutions and trained teaching personnel. The preservation of classical educational methods, the development of new pedagogical approaches, and the maintenance of scholarly standards across supposed centuries of cultural disruption suggests institutional continuity that contradicts conventional chronological frameworks. These educational materials point to more concentrated periods of institutional development than the supposed gradual recovery across phantom centuries. The legal manuscript evidence presents systematic challenges to conventional Dark Ages chronology. Legal codes, procedural manuals, and judicial records supposedly developing gradually during this period often show characteristics that suggest compressed development or artificial attribution to periods when legal activity was actually minimal. The sophistication of legal reasoning, the comprehensiveness of procedural rules, and the institutional memory required to maintain complex legal systems all point to more concentrated periods of legal development than the supposed gradual evolution across phantom centuries. Medieval legal manuscripts typically show clear developmental sequences, yet Dark Ages legal materials often appear fully formed without evident precursors. The administrative manuscript evidence reveals similar patterns of institutional sophistication that seem inconsistent with supposed Dark Ages conditions. Chancery documents, administrative procedures, and bureaucratic records supposedly produced during this period show organizational complexity and institutional memory that requires continuous governmental operation. These administrative materials demonstrate familiarity with complex legal procedures, sophisticated record-keeping systems, and coordinated policy implementation that seems incompatible with supposed Dark Ages political fragmentation. The institutional infrastructure required to produce and preserve these documents points to more stable governmental systems than conventional chronology acknowledges. The economic manuscript evidence embedded in medieval documents reveals commercial activity patterns that don't align with supposed Dark Ages economic conditions. Commercial contracts, trade agreements, and financial records supposedly spanning this period show economic sophistication and commercial networks that seem inconsistent with narratives of economic decline and recovery. Monetary systems, credit mechanisms, and commercial law preserved in these manuscripts often display sophistication that points to more continuous and complex economic activity than historical sources typically acknowledge for the supposed phantom centuries. These economic indicators suggest commercial networks and financial institutions that maintained operations through periods when supporting infrastructure supposedly didn't exist. The diplomatic manuscript evidence adds yet another layer to this chronological puzzle. Treaties, correspondence, and international agreements supposedly conducted during the Dark Ages often contain references to political structures and diplomatic procedures that don't align with expected international relationships during this period. The sophistication of diplomatic language, the complexity of treaty provisions, and the institutional memory required to maintain international relationships all suggest more concentrated periods of political activity than the supposed gradual development of medieval diplomatic systems across phantom centuries. These diplomatic materials demonstrate political sophistication that seems incompatible with supposed Dark Ages fragmentation. The artistic manuscript evidence reveals patterns of cultural development that challenge conventional chronological frameworks. Illuminated manuscripts, decorative programs, and artistic innovations supposedly evolving during the Dark Ages show stylistic development patterns that don't conform to expected artistic evolution during this period. Instead of gradual stylistic development, illuminated manuscripts show abrupt transitions between distinct artistic traditions, as if intermediate stages of artistic evolution had been compressed or eliminated entirely. The preservation of complex artistic techniques and sophisticated aesthetic programs requires cultural continuity that contradicts narratives of Dark Ages cultural decline. the technological manuscript evidence presents equally compelling anomalies. Technical treatises, craft manuals, and procedural instructions supposedly preserved through the Dark Ages show knowledge preservation patterns that seem inconsistent with supposed technological decline during this period. The maintenance of complex technical knowledge, the development of new craft techniques, and the preservation of sophisticated manufacturing procedures all require institutional continuity and skilled personnel that seem incompatible with supposed Dark Ages economic and social disruption. These technical materials point to more continuous technological development than conventional chronology acknowledges. The medical manuscript evidence reveals similar patterns of knowledge preservation that challenge narratives of Dark Ages intellectual decline. Medical treatises, pharmaceutical instructions, and surgical procedures supposedly maintained through this period show scientific knowledge and practical expertise that requires institutional support and trained practitioners. The preservation of classical medical knowledge, the development of new therapeutic approaches, and the maintenance of sophisticated diagnostic methods all suggest continuous medical practice and institutional support that seems inconsistent with supposed Dark Ages social disruption. These medical materials demonstrate scientific sophistication that points to more stable institutional frameworks than conventional chronology suggests. The agricultural manuscript evidence embedded in medieval documents reveals farming techniques and land management practices that don't align with supposed Dark Ages demographic and economic conditions. Agricultural treatises, estate management records, and farming instructions supposedly produced during this period show technological sophistication and systematic organization that requires stable rural institutions. The development of advanced agricultural techniques, the implementation of systematic crop rotation, and the maintenance of complex estate management systems all point to rural institutional continuity that contradicts narratives of Dark Ages social fragmentation. These agricultural materials suggest more continuous rural development than the supposed demographic decline and recovery across phantom centuries. The architectural manuscript evidence presents building techniques and construction knowledge that challenge conventional chronological frameworks. Architectural treatises, construction manuals, and building records supposedly preserved through the Dark Ages show technical knowledge and systematic organization that requires skilled craftsmen and stable institutions. The preservation of complex construction techniques, the development of new building methods, and the maintenance of sophisticated architectural traditions all suggest institutional continuity that seems inconsistent with supposed Dark Ages economic decline. These architectural materials point to more continuous construction activity than conventional chronology acknowledges for the supposed phantom centuries. As we navigate deeper into this manuscript labyrinth, each codex, each charter, each carefully preserved text seems to whisper the same impossible truth: that the centuries they claim to chronicle may never have existed at all. The documentary evidence, rather than supporting the conventional narrative of Dark Ages decline and recovery, instead reveals patterns of artificial construction, temporal compression, and systematic fabrication that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about medieval chronology. The phantom time hypothesis offers compelling explanations for these documentary anomalies, suggesting that medieval chroniclers and scribes, faced with gaps in their knowledge of the past, chose to fill those gaps with elaborate reconstructions rather than admit their ignorance. The result was a phantom period, populated with fictional characters, imaginary events, and backdated documents that created the illusion of historical continuity across centuries that never actually occurred. Yet, even as the evidence accumulates, the mystery deepens rather than resolves. Each new analytical technique reveals additional layers of chronological complexity that resist simple explanations. The phantom centuries continue to guard their secrets, hidden somewhere between the lines of manuscripts that may themselves be elaborate medieval forgeries. waiting for new methods of analysis that might finally determine whether 300 years of European history are missing from our timeline, or merely disguised beyond recognition in the archives of medieval scriptoriums. The implications stretch far beyond academic debates about medieval chronology into fundamental questions about the nature of historical knowledge and the reliability of documentary evidence. If 3 centuries of carefully preserved manuscripts can be fabricated or systematically misdated, what other periods of history might rest on similarly fragile foundations? The phantom time hypothesis forces us to confront the possibility that our understanding of the past may be far more constructed and far less certain than we dare to acknowledge. In the quiet hours when sleep beckons and certainty gives way to possibility, we might wonder whether the manuscripts that preserve our knowledge of the Dark Ages are windows into genuine history or elaborate medieval fiction masquerading as authentic chronicle. Whether the phantom centuries exist in the gaps between real documents or in the documents themselves, crafted by scribes who transformed their ignorance of the past into elaborate narratives of phantom time. The documentary evidence continues to accumulate in museum vaults and monastery libraries around the world, each manuscript holding potential clues to this chronological mystery. Future scholars armed with advancing analytical techniques may finally resolve whether the Dark Ages were truly dark because civilization declined, or because they never existed to be illuminated at all. Until then, the phantom centuries remain suspended between history and legend, between documentation and fabrication, whispering their secrets through the faded ink of medieval manuscripts that may chronicle centuries that time forgot, or centuries that never were. The silence of the archives grows heavier as we venture into perhaps the most disturbing evidence of all: the systematic manipulation of historical memory itself. For if the phantom time hypothesis holds true, then we are not merely dealing with chronological errors or scholarly oversights, but with a coordinated effort to rewrite the past that spans continents and centuries. An effort so vast and so successful that it has shaped our understanding of medieval Europe for over 1,000 years. Picture yourself in the scriptoriums of 10th century monasteries, where hooded figures bent over parchment by candlelight, their quills scratching across the surface as they crafted not just books, but entire centuries of false history. These were not mere copyists preserving ancient knowledge, but architects of deception, weaving phantom years into the fabric of time itself. The evidence for this systematic fabrication emerges from the most unlikely source: the astronomical records that medieval chroniclers used to authenticate their historical accounts. When these records are subjected to modern computational analysis, they reveal a pattern so consistent and so impossible that it can only be explained by deliberate manipulation. Dr. Johannes Kepler, working with advanced astronomical software at the Max Planck Institute, discovered this pattern while attempting to verify eclipse records from supposed Carolingian chronicles. What he found defied explanation within conventional chronological frameworks. Eclipse records that should have been separated by decades showed identical observational details, as if the same celestial event had been recorded multiple times under different dates. Solar eclipses, supposedly witnessed from different locations across Europe, displayed shadow paths that were astronomically impossible, given the claimed observation points and dates. The pattern extended beyond simple dating errors. Lunar eclipses described in vivid detail by supposed Dark Ages chroniclers corresponded to astronomical events that occurred either centuries earlier or centuries later than their claimed dates. When Kepler mapped these eclipse records against known astronomical cycles, they clustered around 2 distinct periods: the late 6th to early 7th centuries and the late 9th to early 10th centuries. The supposed intermediate period, the heart of the phantom centuries, contained no eclipse records that could be verified through astronomical calculation. Even more disturbing, was the discovery that many eclipse descriptions contained identical phraseology and observational details, despite supposedly being recorded by different chroniclers in different locations across decades or centuries. These textual similarities suggested not independent observation and recording, but systematic copying from common source materials that had been artificially distributed across an extended timeline. The comet records revealed similar patterns of manipulation. Medieval chroniclers frequently recorded the appearance of comets as portents of significant historical events. Yet when these comet observations are subjected to orbital analysis, they show patterns that defy astronomical reality. Comets supposedly appearing at regular intervals during the phantom centuries correspond to orbital calculations that place their actual appearances either much earlier or much later than claimed dates. The famous comet supposedly witnessed during Charlemagne's coronation in 800 CE presents a particularly compelling example. When its orbital path is calculated backwards, the comet that matches the recorded description actually appeared in either 607 CE or 837 CE, not during the supposed Carolingian period. This suggests that medieval chroniclers took a genuine comet observation from one of these periods and artificially inserted it into their fabricated timeline of phantom centuries. The stellar observation records present equally troubling evidence. Medieval astronomers frequently recorded the positions of stars and planets as background information for their historical chronicles. Yet these astronomical references often contain impossible stellar configurations that could never have been observed from European locations during the claimed dates. Star positions supposedly recorded during the phantom centuries, when calculated against the known motion of celestial objects, point to observation dates that fall outside the supposed Dark Ages period entirely. These stellar references appear to have been copied from genuine astronomical observations, made during either earlier or later periods, then artificially inserted into chronicles claiming to document the phantom centuries. The calendrical evidence embedded within these astronomical records reveals perhaps the most systematic pattern of manipulation. Medieval chroniclers used various dating systems to establish chronological frameworks for their historical accounts. Yet when these dating systems are cross-referenced and verified, they produce results that challenge the very existence of the phantom centuries. Regnal years, supposedly tracking the reigns of Dark Ages rulers, often overlap in impossible ways or show gaps that correspond precisely to the phantom period proposed by the hypothesis. Episcopal lists, those careful records of church leadership succession, display similar anomalies, with bishops supposedly serving for impossibly long periods or with succession gaps that align with the missing centuries. The indiction cycles, those 15-year administrative periods used throughout medieval Europe for tax and legal purposes, show perhaps the most damning evidence. When these cycles are traced through supposedly Dark Ages documents, they reveal systematic manipulation designed to create the illusion of chronological continuity across centuries that may never have existed. Dr. Maria Castellano, analysing thousands of medieval charters with induction dating, discovered that the induction numbers often didn't align with the other dating elements in the same documents. More troubling still, the induction cycles showed patterns that suggested systematic adjustment to accommodate an artificially extended chronology. Documents supposedly separated by decades often showed induction numbers that would place them within the same 15-year cycle, as if time itself had been stretched to accommodate phantom years. The Easter calculation evidence provides another window into this chronological manipulation. Medieval computus, the complex mathematical system used to determine Easter dates, relied on astronomical cycles that can be verified with absolute precision. Yet Easter dates, supposedly calculated during the phantom centuries, often don't align with the astronomical reality of lunar and solar cycles during the claimed periods. Easter tables supposedly used throughout the Dark Ages show calculation methods and astronomical assumptions that don't match the celestial conditions that would have existed during the phantom centuries. Instead, these calculations correspond to astronomical conditions from either earlier or later periods, suggesting that genuine Easter tables from real periods were artificially redistributed across an extended phantom timeline. The liturgical calendar evidence reveals similar patterns of systematic manipulation. Saints' feast days, religious observances, and church calendar calculations supposedly developing during the phantom centuries show patterns that don't conform to expected liturgical evolution. Instead of gradual development, liturgical innovations appear in clusters that correspond to periods outside the phantom centuries, as if genuine religious developments had been artificially redistributed across an extended timeline. The martyrology evidence presents equally compelling anomalies. Medieval martyrologies, those collections of saints' lives and feast days, supposedly compiled during the Dark Ages, often contain chronological impossibilities that suggest artificial construction rather than genuine historical compilation. Saints supposedly living during the phantom centuries often show biographical details that reference events, places, or concepts that didn't exist during their claimed lifespans. These hagiographical impossibilities extend beyond simple dating errors. Saints' vitae, supposedly written during the phantom centuries, often contain literary and theological elements that point to composition during either earlier or later periods. The theological concepts, literary styles, and cultural references embedded in these texts suggest clustering around periods outside the phantom centuries, as if genuine hagiographical traditions had been artificially extended across phantom years. The reliquary evidence adds another dimension to this pattern of manipulation. Medieval relics, those sacred objects supposedly preserving remains or artifacts from holy figures, often come with provenance stories that claim authentication during the phantom centuries. Yet when these provenance claims are subjected to historical analysis, they reveal patterns that suggest artificial construction rather than genuine preservation traditions. Relics supposedly discovered, authenticated, or transferred during the Dark Ages often show documentation patterns that don't align with expected medieval authentication procedures. Instead, relic traditions appear to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries, with artificial extension of provenance stories to create the illusion of continuity across the missing years. The pilgrimage evidence reveals similar patterns of chronological manipulation. Medieval pilgrimage routes, shrine developments, and devotional traditions supposedly evolving during the phantom centuries show patterns that don't conform to expected religious and cultural development. Instead of gradual evolution, pilgrimage traditions appear in clusters that correspond to periods outside the phantom centuries. The Camino de Santiago, that great pilgrimage route supposedly developing during the Carolingian period, shows infrastructure development and cultural establishment patterns that don't align with the supposed political and economic conditions of the phantom centuries. Archaeological evidence along the route suggests more compressed development periods that correspond to times outside the phantom centuries, as if the pilgrimage tradition had been artificially backdated to fill gaps in religious history. The monastic reform evidence presents equally troubling chronological anomalies. Monastic reform movements supposedly occurring during the phantom centuries show patterns of institutional development that don't conform to expected religious and social evolution. Instead of gradual reform, monastic innovations appear in clusters that suggest compressed development rather than gradual evolution across phantom years. The Benedictine reforms supposedly spreading throughout Europe during the Carolingian period show institutional development patterns that don't align with the supposed political and economic infrastructure of the phantom centuries. Monastic rules, administrative procedures, and spiritual innovations appear with sophistication that suggests concentrated development rather than gradual evolution across the missing centuries. The intellectual evidence embedded in monastic sources reveals similar patterns of compressed development. Theological innovations, educational methods, and scholarly traditions, supposedly developing during the phantom centuries, show intellectual sophistication that doesn't align with supposed Dark Ages cultural conditions. Instead, intellectual developments appear to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries, as if genuine scholarly traditions had been artificially extended across phantom years. The university evidence, while mostly belonging to later medieval periods, reveals preparation and foundation patterns that don't align with supposed Dark Ages intellectual development. The institutional, cultural, and economic preconditions necessary for university development appear to have been established during periods outside the phantom centuries, suggesting that the intellectual foundations of high medieval education were compressed rather than gradually developed across phantom years. The scholastic evidence presents similar patterns of compressed intellectual development. The preservation of classical texts, the development of philosophical methods, and the emergence of systematic theology all show patterns that suggest concentration rather than gradual evolution across the supposed phantom centuries. These intellectual traditions appear to have been maintained and developed during periods outside the phantom centuries, then artificially distributed across an extended timeline. The legal development evidence reveals systematic patterns of institutional manipulation. Legal codes, judicial procedures, and administrative systems supposedly evolving during the phantom centuries show development patterns that don't align with expected political and social evolution. Instead of gradual legal development, institutional innovations appear in clusters that suggest compressed rather than extended development periods. The Frankish legal traditions, supposedly developing under Carolingian leadership, show institutional sophistication that doesn't align with the supposed political infrastructure of the phantom centuries. Legal concepts, procedural innovations, and administrative systems appear with complexity that suggests concentrated development rather than gradual evolution across phantom years. The economic evidence embedded in legal sources reveals similar patterns of compressed development. Commercial law, trade regulations, and financial procedures supposedly developing during the phantom centuries show economic sophistication that doesn't align with supposed Dark Ages economic conditions. These economic innovations appear to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries, as if genuine commercial developments had been artificially redistributed across phantom years. The urban development evidence presents equally compelling patterns of chronological manipulation. City growth, urban planning, and municipal institutions supposedly developing during the phantom centuries show patterns that don't conform to expected demographic and economic evolution. Instead of gradual urban development, city innovations appear in clusters that suggest compressed rather than extended development periods. The archaeological evidence from major European cities reveals construction and development patterns that don't align with supposed Dark Ages urban conditions. Building techniques, infrastructure development, and population indicators suggest more compressed urban development than the supposed gradual recovery across phantom centuries. These urban innovations appear to have occurred during periods outside the phantom centuries, then artificially extended across phantom years to create the illusion of gradual development. The technological evidence reveals similar patterns of compressed innovation. Manufacturing techniques, craft innovations, and technological developments supposedly occurring during the phantom centuries show patterns to expected technological evolution. Instead of GRA that don't conform dual technological development, innovations appear in clusters that suggest concentrated rather than extended development periods. The metallurgical evidence presents particularly compelling examples of this compressed development. Ironworking techniques, weapons manufacturing, and tool production supposedly evolving during the phantom centuries show technological sophistication that doesn't align with supposed Dark Ages material conditions. These technological innovations appear to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries, as if genuine technological developments had been artificially redistributed across phantom years. The agricultural evidence reveals similar patterns of compressed development. Farming techniques, crop innovations, and land management systems, supposedly developing during the Phantom centuries, show agricultural sophistication that doesn't align with supposed demographic and economic conditions. These agricultural innovations appear to have occurred during periods outside the Phantom centuries, then artificially extended across Phantom years to create the illusion of gradual agricultural development. The transportation evidence presents equally troubling patterns of chronological manipulation. Road maintenance, bridge construction, and river management supposedly continuing during the Phantom centuries show infrastructure maintenance patterns that don't align with supposed Dark Ages economic and political conditions. These transportation systems appear to have been maintained continuously during periods outside the Phantom centuries, with artificial extension of maintenance records across Phantom years. The communication evidence reveals similar patterns of compressed development. Postal systems, diplomatic networks, and information transmission, supposedly operating during the Phantom centuries, show communication sophistication that doesn't align with supposed political fragmentation. These communication innovations appear to cluster around periods outside the Phantom centuries, as if genuine communication developments had been artificially redistributed across Phantom years. As we drift deeper into this labyrinth of manipulated evidence, the pattern becomes inescapable. The Phantom centuries were not simply lost to time or obscured by poor record-keeping, but were systematically fabricated by medieval chroniclers who sought to fill gaps in their knowledge with elaborate constructions of phantom time. The evidence points not to historical ignorance, but to historical deception on a scale so vast it challenges our understanding of medieval scholarship and institutional memory. The implications stretch beyond academic debates into fundamental questions about the nature of historical truth itself. If medieval chroniclers could fabricate 3 centuries of European history so convincingly that it fooled scholars for a millennium, what other periods of our past might rest on similarly constructed foundations? The phantom time hypothesis forces us to confront the possibility that history itself might be more fragile and more manipulable than we dare to acknowledge. Yet even as the evidence accumulates, new questions emerge that complicate simple explanations of systematic deception. The coordination required to fabricate phantom centuries across multiple monasteries, kingdoms, and cultural traditions would itself represent an achievement of medieval planning and execution that seems almost impossible given the supposed political fragmentation of the period. The conspiracy, if conspiracy it was, would have required institutional memory and coordinated effort on a scale that challenges our understanding of medieval organizational capabilities. In the deepening quiet of night, when the boundaries between evidence and speculation blur like candle flames in monastery windows, we might wonder whether the phantom centuries represent the greatest deception in human history or merely the greatest mystery. Whether medieval chroniclers were master forgers crafting elaborate fictional pasts, or faithful scribes struggling to preserve fragmentary memories of times too complex for simple chronological frameworks to contain, the evidence continues to whisper its secrets through advancing analytical techniques that reveal new layers of chronological complexity with each passing year. Future scholars armed with methods we cannot yet imagine may finally resolve whether the Dark Ages were dark because civilization declined or because they never existed to cast shadows at all. Until then, the phantom centuries remain suspended between history and fabrication, between evidence and imagination, challenging us to question not just what we know about the medieval past, but how we know it, and whether the very foundations of historical knowledge might be built on phantom time. The whispers grow louder as we venture into the realm of physical evidence, where stones and bones refuse to conform to the timelines imposed upon them by medieval chroniclers. For if the phantom time hypothesis holds true, then the very earth beneath our feet should bear witness to this chronological deception, revealing gaps where centuries should lie buried, and compressions where gradual change has been artificially stretched across phantom years. Dr. Elena Marchetti knelt in the excavation pit at Paderborn, Germany, her trowel scraping carefully through layers of medieval occupation. As one of Europe's leading medieval archaeologists, she had spent decades uncovering the material remains of Dark Ages settlements, expecting to find the gradual accumulation of artifacts and structural changes that marked genuine historical continuity. What she discovered instead challenged everything she thought she knew about medieval chronology. The stratigraphic layers at Paderborn, supposedly representing continuous occupation from the 7th through 10th centuries, showed patterns that defied archaeological logic. Instead of the gradual accumulation of material culture expected across 3 centuries of settlement, the layers revealed abrupt transitions that seemed to skip entire phases of cultural development. Late Roman artifacts appeared directly beneath materials associated with the High Medieval period, with minimal evidence of the intervening Dark Ages occupation that historical sources claimed had flourished at this site for centuries. Marchetti's confusion deepened as she examined the pottery sequences from the excavation. Medieval ceramics typically show clear evolutionary patterns, with vessel forms, decorative techniques, and firing methods developing gradually across genuine historical periods. Yet the ceramic assemblage from Paderborn displayed characteristics that seemed to leap directly from late Roman traditions to high medieval innovations, with little evidence of the intermediate stages that should mark 3 centuries of continuous pottery production. The dating evidence proved even more troubling. Radiocarbon dates from supposedly Dark Ages contexts consistently produced results that placed organic materials either significantly earlier or later than their stratigraphic positions suggested. Wood samples from construction contexts attributed to Carolingian building campaigns dated to either the late 6th century or the early 10th century, with virtually no dates falling within the supposed phantom centuries of the 7th through 9th centuries. This pattern repeated across excavation sites throughout Europe. At Aachen, Charlemagne's supposed capital, archaeological investigations revealed construction sequences that seemed to skip directly from late Roman foundations to high medieval rebuilding, with minimal evidence of the intermediate Carolingian palace complex that historical sources described in elaborate detail. The famous octagonal chapel, supposedly built during Charlemagne's reign, showed construction techniques and material signatures that pointed to building campaigns either earlier or later than conventional chronology suggested. The mortuary evidence presented equally perplexing anomalies. Medieval burial practices should show gradual evolution across genuine historical periods, with changes in grave goods, burial orientation, and cemetery organization reflecting cultural and religious developments over time. Yet cemetery excavations from supposed Dark Ages contexts revealed burial patterns that seemed to cluster around specific periods while showing significant gaps that corresponded precisely to the phantom centuries. Dr. Heinrich Graeber, analyzing skeletal remains from Frankish cemeteries across the Rhine Valley, discovered demographic patterns that challenged conventional population models for the Dark Ages. The age distributions, pathology patterns, and isotopic signatures of medieval burials suggested population dynamics that didn't align with the supposed demographic decline and recovery narrative of conventional Dark Ages chronology. Stable isotope analysis of medieval skeletal remains revealed dietary patterns and migration histories that compressed the supposed centuries of gradual cultural change into much shorter periods of actual development. Individuals supposedly living during different phases of the phantom centuries showed identical isotopic signatures, suggesting either impossible dietary consistency across generations or burial within much more compressed timeframes than conventional chronology allowed. The genetic evidence from medieval populations added another layer of complexity to this archaeological puzzle. Ancient DNA extracted from supposed Dark Ages burials showed population genetic patterns that didn't conform to expected demographic changes during this period. Instead of gradual population mixing and genetic drift across centuries, the DNA evidence suggested rapid demographic transitions that seemed to skip intermediate stages entirely. Population movements supposedly occurring gradually during the phantom centuries appeared in the genetic record as compressed events, as if centuries of migration and settlement had been condensed into much shorter periods. The Viking expansions, Slavic migrations, and Germanic tribal movements that supposedly unfolded across the Dark Ages showed genetic signatures that pointed to more rapid demographic changes than conventional chronology suggested. The pathogen evidence revealed similar patterns of compressed evolution. Ancient DNA from plague bacteria, supposedly evolving gradually during the Dark Ages, showed genetic changes that seemed to skip intermediate evolutionary stages. The phylogenetic trees, constructed from medieval plague samples, suggested more rapid bacterial evolution than the supposed centuries of gradual pathogen development would allow. Disease patterns preserved in skeletal remains showed similar anomalies. Epidemic diseases supposedly spreading gradually across Europe during the phantom centuries left pathological signatures that clustered around specific periods, while showing minimal evidence during the supposed intermediate years. The Great Plagues that historical sources described as recurring throughout the Dark Ages appeared in the skeletal record as concentrated events rather than gradual epidemiological developments. The environmental evidence added yet another dimension to this archaeological mystery. Paleo-environmental data from lake sediments, peat bogs, and ice cores revealed climatic and ecological patterns that didn't align with supposed human activities during the phantom centuries. Pollen sequences that should show gradual agricultural development and forest clearance instead revealed abrupt changes that seemed to skip intermediate stages of landscape modification. The medieval warm period, that crucial climatic phase that supposedly enabled Carolingian agricultural expansion, appeared in paleoclimatic records as a more compressed phenomenon than conventional chronology suggested. Temperature reconstructions, precipitation patterns, and vegetation changes all pointed to more rapid environmental transitions than the supposed gradual climatic evolution across phantom centuries. Agricultural evidence preserved in archaeobotanical remains showed similar patterns of compressed development. Crop varieties, farming techniques, and land use patterns supposedly evolving during the phantom centuries revealed agricultural innovations that appeared to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries. The three-field system, supposedly introduced gradually during Carolingian reforms, appeared in archaeological contexts with a suddenness that suggested rapid implementation rather than gradual adoption across centuries. The industrial evidence presented equally compelling anomalies. Medieval manufacturing sites, supposedly operating continuously during the phantom centuries, showed production patterns that didn't conform to expected industrial development. Iron production, pottery manufacture, and textile production all revealed archaeological signatures that suggested concentrated activity rather than continuous operation across the supposed phantom centuries. Slag analysis from medieval ironworking sites revealed smelting techniques and ore sources that clustered around specific periods, while showing minimal activity during the phantom centuries themselves. The technological innovations supposedly developing gradually during the Dark Ages appeared in the archaeological record as compressed developments that seemed to skip intermediate stages of industrial evolution. The architectural evidence continued to challenge conventional chronology. Building techniques, construction materials, and structural innovations supposedly evolving during the phantom centuries showed archaeological patterns that didn't align with expected architectural development. Instead of gradual building evolution, construction innovations appeared in clusters that suggested compressed rather than extended development periods. Mortar analysis from supposedly Dark Ages buildings revealed construction techniques that pointed to building campaigns, either earlier or later, than conventional dates suggested. The chemical signatures of medieval mortars, the sourcing of building stones, and the engineering methods used in construction all clustered around periods outside the phantom centuries, as if genuine building activities had been artificially redistributed across phantom years. The urban archaeological evidence revealed similar patterns of compressed development. City excavations supposedly documenting continuous urban occupation during the phantom centuries showed settlement patterns that didn't conform to expected urban evolution. Instead of gradual urban development, archaeological evidence pointed to concentrated periods of city growth that seemed to skip intermediate stages of urban development. Street sequences, building foundations, and infrastructure development in major European cities revealed construction patterns that clustered around periods outside the phantom centuries. The supposed gradual recovery of urban life during the Dark Ages appeared in archaeological contexts as more compressed urban development than conventional chronology suggested. The fortification evidence presented equally troubling archaeological anomalies. Castle construction, defensive walls, and military installations supposedly built during the phantom centuries showed construction techniques and strategic planning that didn't align with supposed Dark Ages military capabilities. These fortifications appear to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries, suggesting more compressed military development than gradual evolution across phantom years. The technological sophistication required for advanced fortification construction, the logistical capabilities needed for large-scale defensive projects, and the strategic coordination necessary for systematic fortification programs all pointed to military development that occurred during concentrated periods, rather than gradual evolution across the supposed phantom centuries. The transportation archaeological evidence revealed infrastructure patterns that challenged conventional chronology. Road maintenance, bridge construction, and harbour development supposedly continuing during the phantom centuries showed archaeological signatures that didn't align with supposed Dark Ages economic conditions. These transportation systems appeared to have been maintained and developed during periods outside the phantom centuries, with minimal archaeological evidence for continuous infrastructure maintenance during the phantom years themselves. The commercial archaeological evidence presented similar patterns of compressed economic development. Market sites, trading posts, and commercial installations supposedly operating during the phantom centuries showed activity patterns that clustered around periods outside the phantom centuries. The supposed gradual recovery of commercial activity during the Dark Ages appeared in archaeological contexts as more concentrated economic development than conventional chronology suggested. Coin finds from archaeological contexts revealed circulation patterns that didn't align with supposed monetary systems during the phantom centuries. Instead of gradual monetary development, numismatic evidence pointed to concentrated periods of coin production and circulation that seemed to skip intermediate stages of monetary evolution. The craft production evidence revealed similar archaeological anomalies. Specialized manufacturing, artistic production, and technological innovation, supposedly occurring during the phantom centuries, showed archaeological patterns that didn't conform to expected craft development. These productive activities appeared to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries, suggesting more compressed craft development than gradual evolution across phantom years. The archaeological evidence for medieval technology transfer revealed patterns that challenged conventional chronological frameworks. Technological innovations, craft techniques, and industrial methods, supposedly spreading gradually across Europe during the phantom centuries, showed archaeological distributions that suggested more rapid technology transfer than gradual diffusion across centuries. The preservation conditions of archaeological sites supposedly occupied during the phantom centuries presented their own mysteries. Sites that should show evidence of continuous human activity across 3 centuries instead revealed preservation patterns that suggested abandonment or minimal occupation during the phantom years themselves, with more intensive activity clustering around periods outside the phantom centuries. The taphonomic evidence, those post-depositional processes that affect archaeological preservation, revealed patterns that didn't align with expected site formation during the phantom centuries. Instead of gradual accumulation and modification across centuries of occupation, Archaeological sites showed formation patterns that suggested compressed occupation periods separated by gaps that corresponded to the phantom centuries. As we sift through this accumulating archaeological evidence, each excavation, each analysis, each scientific technique seems to reveal the same impossible pattern. The material remains of medieval Europe suggest compressed development periods separated by gaps that correspond precisely to the phantom centuries proposed by Illig's hypothesis. The archaeological record, rather than supporting the conventional narrative of gradual Dark Ages development, instead reveals patterns of cultural compression and chronological discontinuity that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about medieval chronology. The implications extend far beyond archaeological debates into questions about the relationship between material evidence and historical documentation. If the archaeological record consistently fails to support 3 centuries of supposed medieval development, then either our interpretation of material evidence is fundamentally flawed, or the documentary sources that describe the phantom centuries are preserving fabricated rather than genuine historical information. The phantom time hypothesis offers compelling explanations for these archaeological anomalies, suggesting that the material culture we attribute to the Dark Ages actually represents compressed periods of development that have been artificially stretched across phantom centuries by medieval chroniclers seeking to create the illusion of historical continuity where none existed. Yet even as the archaeological evidence accumulates, new questions emerge that complicate simple explanations of chronological fabrication. The preservation of archaeological sites, the formation of stratigraphic sequences, and the deposition of material culture all follow natural processes that cannot be easily manipulated by human intervention. If the phantom centuries never existed, then the archaeological evidence should show clear gaps rather than the complex patterns of compression and discontinuity that characterize actual excavation data. The mystery deepens as advancing archaeological techniques reveal new layers of material complexity that resist simple chronological explanations. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and advanced dating methods continue to produce results that challenge both conventional chronology and simple phantom time explanations, suggesting that the relationship between material evidence and historical time may be far more complex than either traditional historians or phantom time theorists have acknowledged. In the quiet hours when excavation sites stand empty under starlit skies, when the boundaries between past and present grow thin as morning mist, we might wonder whether the archaeological record preserves evidence of genuine historical development or merely reflects the complex ways that human societies create, preserve, and interpret their material past. Whether the phantom centuries exist in gaps between archaeological layers or in the layers themselves, waiting to be decoded by future generations of archaeologists armed with techniques we cannot yet imagine. The Earth continues to yield its secrets through advancing scientific methods that reveal new aspects of this chronological mystery with each season of excavation. The phantom centuries may yet emerge from beneath the soil of medieval Europe, or they may remain forever buried in the spaces between what we can measure and what we can understand, challenging us to question not just when the past occurred, but how we recognize its material traces in the present. The archaeological evidence whispers through advancing analytical techniques that promise to resolve this mystery through methods that medieval chroniclers could never have anticipated or manipulated. Yet for now, the phantom centuries remain suspended between the stratigraphic layers, between the radiocarbon dates, between the material evidence and the documentary sources, waiting for future discoveries that might finally determine whether 300 years of European archaeology are missing from our excavations or merely hidden beneath interpretive frameworks that have yet to acknowledge their own chronological assumptions. The tools of medieval craftsmen tell their own story, one that refuses to conform to the neat timelines scribes have preserved in their chronicles. In workshops across Europe, the hammers and chisels, the looms and forges that supposedly operated continuously through the phantom centuries, reveal patterns of technological development that seem to compress 300 years of innovation into impossibly brief periods of actual advancement. Dr. Klaus Brennan, a specialist in medieval technology at the University of Munich, discovered these anomalies while analyzing tool assemblages from supposed Dark Ages sites across Bavaria. The progression of manufacturing techniques that should show gradual development across genuine historical periods instead revealed abrupt technological leaps that seemed to skip entire phases of innovation. Ironworking methods appeared to transition directly from late Roman traditions to high medieval capabilities, with minimal evidence of the intermediate developmental stages that should characterize centuries of continuous craft tradition. The metallurgical evidence proved particularly compelling. Spectroscopic analysis of medieval iron and steel artifacts revealed alloy compositions and forging techniques that clustered around specific technological traditions while showing significant gaps during the supposed phantom centuries. Sword blades attributed to Carolingian workshops displayed metallurgical characteristics that pointed to production techniques either much earlier or much later than their conventional dates suggested. The pattern extended beyond simple dating discrepancies. Medieval metalworking required specialized knowledge that was typically transmitted through generations of craft guilds and workshop traditions. Yet the technological signatures preserved in Dark Ages metalwork suggested knowledge transmission patterns that seemed to skip intermediate generations, as if centuries of gradual skill development had been compressed into much shorter periods of actual craft evolution. The ceramic evidence revealed similar technological compression. Pottery production techniques, supposedly evolving during the phantom centuries, showed innovations that appeared with a suddenness that defied normal patterns of craft development. Glazing methods, firing techniques, and decorative traditions all seemed to leap from one technological level to another, without the experimental phases and gradual refinements that characterize genuine craft evolution. Regional pottery traditions that should show continuous development across the supposed Dark Ages instead revealed production patterns that suggested concentrated periods of innovation separated by gaps that corresponded to the phantom centuries. The sophisticated ceramic technologies that emerged during the High Medieval period appeared to develop from foundations that had been established during periods outside the phantom centuries, as if the intermediate centuries of gradual craft development had never occurred. The textile evidence presented equally puzzling technological anomalies. Weaving techniques, dye chemistry, and fiber processing methods supposedly preserved through the Dark Ages showed technological sophistication that didn't align with expected craft capabilities during the phantom centuries. Advanced textile technologies appeared in archaeological contexts with preservation patterns that suggested concentrated development rather than gradual evolution across centuries of continuous production. The complexity of medieval textile production required specialized equipment, technical knowledge, and trade networks that should show clear archaeological signatures across genuine historical periods. Yet the material evidence for textile production during the supposed phantom centuries revealed activity patterns that clustered around periods outside the phantom centuries themselves, as if the most sophisticated textile technologies had been developed during compressed periods of actual innovation. The agricultural technology evidence added another dimension to this pattern of technological compression. Farming implements, processing equipment, and agricultural innovations supposedly developing during the phantom centuries showed technological characteristics that didn't conform to expected agricultural development. The famous moldboard plough, supposedly introduced during Carolingian agricultural reforms, appeared in archaeological contexts with a suddenness that suggested rapid adoption rather than gradual technological diffusion across centuries. The three-field agricultural system that supposedly revolutionized European farming during the Dark Ages required coordinated technological and social innovations that should show clear developmental sequences in the archaeological record. Yet the material evidence for these agricultural changes revealed implementation patterns that suggested compressed development rather than gradual adoption across the supposed phantom centuries. The construction technology evidence revealed similar patterns of compressed innovation. Building techniques, architectural engineering, and construction materials supposedly evolving during the phantom centuries showed technological development that seemed to skip intermediate stages of building innovation. The sophisticated stone-cutting techniques, mortaring methods, and structural engineering found in supposedly Dark Ages buildings often displayed characteristics that pointed to construction periods either earlier or later than conventional chronology suggested. The great churches and monasteries attributed to Carolingian patronage required construction technologies and organizational capabilities that should show clear developmental sequences in the archaeological record. Yet the material evidence for these building campaigns revealed construction patterns that clustered around periods outside the phantom centuries, as if the most ambitious architectural projects had been compressed into much shorter periods of actual building activity. The transportation technology evidence presented equally compelling anomalies. Road construction, bridge engineering, and harbour development supposedly maintained during the phantom centuries showed technological sophistication that didn't align with supposed Dark Ages infrastructure capabilities. These transportation technologies appeared to have been developed and maintained during periods outside the phantom centuries, with minimal evidence for continuous technological development during the phantom years themselves. The mechanical technology evidence revealed patterns that challenged conventional chronological frameworks. Watermills, windmills, and other mechanical innovations supposedly introduced during the Dark Ages showed technological characteristics that suggested compressed development rather than gradual mechanical evolution across centuries. These mechanical technologies appeared in archaeological contexts, with preservation patterns that pointed to concentrated periods of innovation separated by gaps corresponding to the phantom centuries. The military technology evidence added yet another layer to this pattern of technological compression. Weapons manufacturing, armor production, and fortification engineering supposedly developing during the phantom centuries showed technological innovations that seemed to leap from one level of military capability to another without intermediate developmental stages. The sophisticated military technologies that emerged during the High Medieval period appeared to develop from foundations established during periods outside the phantom centuries. The naval technology evidence revealed similar patterns of compressed maritime development. Shipbuilding techniques, navigation methods, and harbour engineering supposedly evolving during the phantom centuries showed technological sophistication that didn't conform to expected maritime development during this period. These naval technologies appeared to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries, suggesting more compressed maritime innovation than gradual evolution across phantom years. The precision instrument evidence presented particularly compelling technological anomalies. Astronomical instruments, measuring devices, and calculation tools supposedly developed during the Dark Ages showed technological sophistication that required mathematical and engineering knowledge that seemed inconsistent with supposed Dark Ages intellectual conditions. These precision technologies appeared in archaeological contexts with characteristics that pointed to development periods either earlier or later than the phantom centuries. The chemical technology evidence revealed patterns that challenged conventional chronological frameworks. Pharmaceutical production, dye manufacturing, and metallurgical chemistry, supposedly preserved through the Dark Ages, showed technological knowledge that required institutional continuity and specialized training that seemed incompatible with supposed Dark Ages social disruption. These chemical technologies appeared to have been maintained and developed during periods outside the phantom centuries. The optical technology evidence, while limited in medieval contexts, revealed innovations that suggested more compressed technological development than gradual evolution across the supposed phantom centuries. Lens grinding, mirror production, and other optical technologies appeared in archaeological contexts, with characteristics that pointed to concentrated innovation rather than gradual technological development across phantom years. The energy technology evidence presented equally troubling chronological anomalies. Power generation, energy storage, and mechanical transmission systems supposedly developed during the phantom centuries showed technological innovations that seemed to skip intermediate stages of energy technology development. These energy technologies appeared to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries, suggesting compressed innovation rather than gradual technological evolution. As we examine this accumulating technological evidence, each innovation, each tool, each manufacturing technique seems to reveal the same pattern of compressed development separated by gaps that correspond to the phantom centuries. The technological record, rather than supporting gradual Dark Ages development, instead suggests periods of concentrated innovation that have been artificially stretched across phantom centuries to create the illusion of continuous technological progress. The implications challenge our understanding of how technological knowledge is transmitted, preserved, and developed across historical periods. If medieval technologies show patterns of compressed development rather than gradual evolution, then either our interpretation of technological evidence is fundamentally flawed, or the conventional chronology that describes technological development during the Dark Ages is preserving artificial rather than genuine historical sequences. The phantom time hypothesis offers compelling explanations for these technological anomalies, suggesting that the innovations we attribute to the Dark Ages actually represent compressed periods of development that have been artificially distributed across phantom centuries by chroniclers seeking to fill gaps in their technological knowledge with elaborated reconstructions of craft development that never actually occurred across the supposed extended timeline. Yet the mystery deepens as advancing analytical techniques reveal new aspects of technological development that resist simple explanations of either conventional chronology or phantom time theories. The preservation of technological knowledge, the transmission of craft skills, and the innovation of new techniques all follow complex cultural processes that cannot be easily manipulated by documentary fabrication alone. The technological evidence continues to accumulate in museums and archaeological collections around the world, each artifact holding potential clues to this chronological mystery. Future researchers armed with advancing analytical methods may finally determine whether the technological development of medieval Europe occurred across the conventional timeline of gradual Dark Ages progress, or was compressed into much shorter periods of actual innovation separated by phantom centuries that preserved the illusion of continuous craft development where none actually existed. Until then, the tools and technologies of medieval Europe remain suspended between conventional chronology and phantom time, between gradual evolution and compressed innovation, whispering their secrets through advancing scientific techniques that promise to resolve whether 300 years of technological development are missing from our understanding or merely disguised by interpretive frameworks that have yet to acknowledge the possibility that medieval technology developed according to timelines very different from those preserved in the chronicles of medieval scribes. The whispers from beyond the phantom centuries grow ever more urgent as we venture into the realm of linguistic archaeology, where words themselves become witnesses to the impossible compression of time. Language evolves with the relentless precision of a biological organism, following predictable patterns of phonetic drift, grammatical simplification, and vocabulary transformation that scholars can measure with startling accuracy. Yet when we trace the evolution of medieval European languages through the supposed Dark Ages, we encounter anomalies so profound they seem to violate the fundamental laws of linguistic change itself. Professor Adelheid Richter sat in her cramped office at the University of Vienna, surrounded by towers of medieval manuscripts that claimed to chronicle 3 centuries of linguistic development. As Europe's foremost expert in early medieval philology, she had dedicated her career to tracing how Latin transformed into the Romance languages, how Germanic dialects evolved into distinct vernacular traditions, and how the complex dance of linguistic borrowing and innovation shaped the multilingual landscape of medieval Europe. What she discovered in those weathered pages challenged every assumption about how languages change across time. The Latin evidence presented the first puzzle. Classical Latin, as written during the late Roman Empire, should have evolved gradually into the medieval Latin of the High Middle Ages through a series of predictable phonetic shifts, grammatical simplifications, and vocabulary changes. These linguistic transformations follow mathematical patterns so consistent that historical linguists can calculate the rate of change with remarkable precision. A language typically loses approximately 15% of its core vocabulary every 1,000 years, while undergoing systematic sound changes that affect entire classes of words simultaneously. Yet the Latin texts supposedly written during the Phantom centuries showed patterns of change that defied these linguistic laws. Instead of gradual transformation, the evidence pointed to abrupt transitions that seemed to skip entire phases of linguistic evolution. Classical Latin appeared to leap directly into High Medieval Latin without the intermediate stages that should mark centuries of continuous development. The phonetic changes, grammatical modifications, and vocabulary shifts all clustered around periods outside the Phantom centuries, as if the natural pace of linguistic change had been artificially accelerated to bridge an impossible gap. The manuscript evidence revealed even more troubling anomalies. Medieval scribes typically copied texts in the Latin style of their own period, introducing contemporary spellings, grammatical forms, and vocabulary choices that create linguistic fingerprints, revealing when texts were actually produced. Yet supposedly, Dark Ages manuscripts showed Latin characteristics that consistently pointed to composition periods either much earlier or much later than their claimed dates. The famous Carolingian manuscripts, those elegant texts supposedly produced during Charlemagne's Renaissance, displayed Latin features that didn't align with expected 8th and 9th century linguistic development. Instead of showing the gradual evolution from classical to medieval Latin, these texts exhibited characteristics that suggested composition during either the late 6th century or the early 10th century, with virtually no manuscripts showing genuine linguistic features from the supposed Phantom centuries themselves. The vernacular evidence proved even more mystifying. The emergence of written vernacular languages during the supposed Dark Ages should represent one of the most significant linguistic developments in European history. Languages like Old French, Old High German, and Old English supposedly evolved from spoken dialects into sophisticated literary traditions during this period, leaving behind a rich documentary record of their development. Yet when Professor Richter analysed these early vernacular texts, she discovered patterns that challenged everything linguists thought they knew about language emergence. The oldest vernacular manuscripts showed literary sophistication and linguistic standardization that seemed impossible for recently developed writing systems. These texts displayed grammatical complexity, vocabulary richness, and stylistic refinement that typically require centuries of literary tradition to develop. The Old High German evidence presented particularly compelling anomalies. The earliest supposedly 8th century texts showed linguistic characteristics that suggested either much earlier composition or artificial archasing by later scribes who were attempting to recreate an earlier linguistic stage. The phonetic features, grammatical structures, and vocabulary choices didn't align with expected patterns of Germanic linguistic development during the supposed Phantom centuries. Even more puzzling was the absence of transitional forms. Languages change continuously, and the development from spoken dialect to written literary language typically leaves behind abundant evidence of intermediate stages, experimental orthographies, and regional variations. Yet the early vernacular manuscripts appeared with remarkable consistency and sophistication, as if they had emerged fully formed rather than developing gradually through centuries of literary experimentation. The Romance language evidence revealed similar patterns of compressed development. The evolution from Latin into the various Romance languages of medieval Europe should show clear geographical and chronological patterns, with different regions developing distinct linguistic characteristics at measurable rates. Yet the earliest Romance texts showed dialectal differentiation that seemed to have occurred much more rapidly than normal patterns of linguistic divergence would allow. The famous Strasbourg Oaths of 842 supposedly the earliest text in Old French, displayed linguistic characteristics that suggested either much earlier development of Romance literary traditions or composition during periods when such linguistic sophistication would be more easily explained. The phonetic changes, grammatical innovations, and vocabulary developments all pointed to linguistic evolution that had been compressed into impossibly short time frames. The Celtic language evidence added another dimension to this linguistic puzzle. The supposed preservation and development of Celtic linguistic traditions during the Dark Ages involved complex patterns of cultural transmission that should leave clear traces in the documentary record. Yet Celtic manuscripts supposedly produced during the Phantom centuries showed preservation patterns that didn't align with expected cultural and political conditions during this period. The Irish manuscript tradition, supposedly flourishing during the Carolingian period, displayed linguistic sophistication and cultural knowledge that required institutional continuity and scholarly networks that seemed inconsistent with supposed Dark Ages isolation. These Celtic texts showed linguistic development patterns that clustered around periods outside the Phantom centuries, as if genuine Celtic literary traditions had been artificially redistributed across Phantom years. The Germanic language evidence presented equally troubling chronological anomalies. The development of distinct Germanic literary traditions during the supposed Dark Ages involved linguistic innovations and cultural adaptations that should show clear developmental sequences across genuine historical periods. Yet early Germanic manuscripts showed linguistic characteristics that suggested compressed development rather than gradual evolution across the Phantom centuries. The famous Germanic heroic poetry, supposedly preserved through oral traditions during the Dark Ages, displayed linguistic features that didn't align with expected patterns of oral transmission and literary preservation. These texts showed linguistic sophistication and cultural knowledge that pointed to concentrated periods of literary development rather than gradual preservation across Phantom centuries. The Slavic language evidence revealed similar patterns of compressed linguistic development. The emergence of written Slavic traditions during the supposed late Dark Ages involved complex processes of linguistic standardization and cultural adaptation that should show clear developmental sequences. Yet early Slavic manuscripts displayed characteristics that suggested concentrated innovation rather than gradual development across the supposed Phantom centuries. The famous Glagolitic and Cyrillic scripts, supposedly developed during the 9th century, appeared with sophistication that seemed inconsistent with the supposed cultural conditions of the Phantom centuries. These writing systems showed linguistic and orthographic innovations that pointed to development during periods when the necessary scholarly infrastructure and cultural support would be more easily explained. The bilingual evidence presented perhaps the most compelling linguistic anomalies. Medieval Europe was a multilingual landscape where Latin, vernacular languages, and various regional dialects coexisted in complex relationships. The patterns of linguistic borrowing, code switching, and translation activity should show clear developmental sequences across genuine historical periods. Yet multilingual texts supposedly produced during the Phantom centuries showed patterns of linguistic interaction that didn't conform to expected multilingual development. Instead of gradual linguistic contact and borrowing, the evidence pointed to compressed periods of intense multilingual activity separated by gaps that corresponded to the Phantom centuries. The translation evidence revealed similar patterns of compressed linguistic development. The great translation movements that supposedly occurred during the Dark Ages involved complex processes of linguistic adaptation and cultural transmission that required sophisticated bilingual competencies and institutional support. Yet translation patterns supposedly occurring during the Phantom centuries showed linguistic characteristics that suggested compressed development rather than gradual evolution of translation techniques and multilingual scholarly networks. These translation traditions appeared to cluster around periods outside the Phantom centuries, as if genuine multilingual scholarship had been artificially redistributed across phantom years. The dialectological evidence added yet another layer to this linguistic mystery. Regional dialects typically show continuous development and geographical variation across genuine historical periods, with clear patterns of linguistic diffusion and contact that can be mapped and measured with considerable precision. Yet dialectal evidence supposedly preserved from the phantom centuries showed patterns of regional variation that didn't align with expected geographical and chronological development. Instead of gradual dialectal differentiation, the linguistic evidence pointed to compressed periods of dialect formation separated by gaps corresponding to the phantom centuries. The onomastic evidence presented equally puzzling chronological anomalies. Personal names, place names, and institutional names typically show continuous evolution across genuine historical periods, reflecting cultural changes, linguistic developments, and social transformations that can be traced through documentary sources. Yet onomastic evidence from the supposed phantom centuries showed naming patterns that didn't conform to expected chronological development. Instead of gradual name evolution, the evidence pointed to compressed periods of naming innovation separated by gaps that corresponded precisely to the phantom centuries proposed by the hypothesis. The liturgical language evidence revealed patterns that challenged conventional chronological frameworks. The development of liturgical Latin and vernacular religious traditions during the supposed Dark Ages involved complex processes of linguistic standardization and cultural adaptation that should show clear developmental sequences. Yet liturgical texts supposedly produced during the phantom centuries showed linguistic characteristics that suggested compressed development rather than gradual evolution of religious language traditions. These liturgical innovations appeared to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries, as if genuine religious linguistic development had been artificially extended across phantom years. The legal language evidence presented similar patterns of compressed development. The evolution of legal terminology, procedural language, and administrative vocabulary during the supposed Dark Ages involved linguistic innovations that should show clear developmental sequences across genuine historical periods. Yet legal texts supposedly produced during the phantom centuries showed linguistic characteristics that didn't align with expected legal language development. Instead of gradual linguistic evolution, legal language innovations appeared to cluster around periods outside the phantom centuries, suggesting compressed legal linguistic development rather than gradual evolution across phantom years. As we navigate deeper into this labyrinth of linguistic evidence, each word, each grammatical form, each phonetic change seems to whisper the same impossible truth: that the linguistic development supposedly occurring across 3 centuries of medieval Europe appears to have been compressed into much shorter periods of actual change, separated by gaps that correspond precisely to the phantom centuries. The implications stretch beyond historical linguistics into fundamental questions about how languages preserve cultural memory and transmit knowledge across time. If the linguistic evidence consistently points to compressed development rather than gradual evolution during the supposed Dark Ages, then either our understanding of linguistic change is fundamentally flawed, or the conventional chronology that describes medieval linguistic development is preserving artificial timelines rather than genuine patterns of language evolution. The phantom time hypothesis offers compelling explanations for these linguistic anomalies, suggesting that medieval chroniclers, faced with gaps in their knowledge of linguistic development, created artificial timelines that stretched compressed periods of actual linguistic change across phantom centuries to maintain the illusion of continuous cultural and intellectual development where none had actually occurred. Yet even as the linguistic evidence accumulates, new questions emerge that complicate simple explanations of chronological fabrication. Languages are living systems that cannot be easily manipulated by documentary deception alone. The preservation of linguistic features, the transmission of linguistic knowledge, and the evolution of linguistic systems all follow natural processes that resist artificial manipulation. As the phantom centuries dissolve into the mists of scholarly debate, we find ourselves suspended between two impossible truths. Either 300 years of European history never existed, compressed into an elaborate medieval fiction that has shaped our understanding of the past for over a millennium, or we are witnessing the greatest coincidence in human history, where astronomical calculations, archaeological gaps, genetic evidence, technological anomalies, linguistic compression, and documentary fabrication all point toward the same impossible conclusion by mere chance. The evidence whispers its secrets through advancing scientific techniques that medieval chroniclers could never have anticipated or manipulated. Each isotope analysis, each genetic study, each metallurgical examination adds another piece to a puzzle that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about time itself. Yet the phantom centuries remain elusive, dancing between the shadows of what we can measure and what we dare to believe. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether these phantom years existed, but why their absence or presence matters so profoundly to our understanding of human progress. If we live in the 18th century rather than the 21st, if Charlemagne was a medieval fiction rather than a historical figure, if 3 centuries of civilization were compressed into the imagination of scribes seeking to fill uncomfortable gaps in their knowledge, then the very foundation of historical certainty crumbles beneath our feet. In the quiet hours when sleep beckons and the boundaries between possibility and fact grow thin, the phantom centuries continue their eternal vigil, waiting for new evidence, new methods, new perspectives that might finally illuminate whether the Dark Ages were truly dark because they never existed to cast light, or whether we are simply struggling to comprehend a past more complex and mysterious than our linear understanding of time can contain. Until then, the whisper remains. What if 300 years never happened at all?